Sometimes a single moment can change everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Sometimes that moment comes when we least expect it, wrapped in dust and mystery. In Cinder Valley, no man had ever broken Midnight Mercy, the black stallion that threw every cowboy who tried. When Lark Hollis joked that she'd marry whoever could tame the devil horse, everyone laughed. Until a quiet stranger stepped forward. He walked into the corral and whispered something only the horse could hear. Midnight Mercy lowered his head for the first time in his wild life. The cowboy turned to Lark and said simply, "Name's yours if you want it." What began as a joke was about to become something deeper than anyone imagined. But what secret did this stranger carry that made Wild Things trust him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cinder Valley as Lark Hollis stood at her bedroom window, watching the man who had changed everything with a whisper. 3 days had passed since the barn raising, and still the valley buzzed with talk of what they'd witnessed. Some called it magic, others said it was luck. But Lark knew what she'd seen, the way Midnight Mercy's wild eyes had softened, the way his trembling had stilled, the way he'd surrendered to a stranger's gentle voice when he'd fought every other man who dared approach. Below in the corral, Trace moved with quiet purpose among the horses. She didn't even know his full name, yet here he was, working her father's ranch as if he belonged. The other hands had accepted him with the grudging respect reserved for those who proved themselves through action rather than words. But acceptance and understanding were different things entirely. Cinder Valley had been Hollis land for 3 generations. Her grandfather had carved the first homestead from the wilderness, and her father, Jeremiah Hollis, had built it into the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. The ornate iron gate at the ranch entrance bore their family crest, a soaring eagle, clutching a cluster of wheat forged by her grandfather's own hands and painted fresh each spring. It represented everything the Hollis name stood for: strength, prosperity, and permanence. Permanence. The word tasted bitter in Lark's mouth as she traced patterns in the frost on her window. At 24, she was already considered past the prime age for marriage by valley standards. Her father had grown increasingly vocal about his expectations, especially since the McBride boy from the neighboring ranch had begun making his intentions clear. Thomas McBride was everything a father could want for his daughter: wealthy, respectable, predictable. He was also everything Lark found suffocating. "Lark," her father's voice carried up the stairs, warm but firm. "Coffee's getting cold." She sighed and turned from the window, but not before catching another glimpse of Trace as he led a mare toward the water trough. Even from this distance, she could see the careful gentleness in his movements, the way he paused to let the horse set the pace. It was such a small thing, yet it spoke volumes about the man. The kitchen smelled of biscuits and bacon, the comfortable sense of home that usually brought her peace. But this morning, even the familiar surroundings felt charged with unspoken tension. Her father sat at the head of the weathered oak table, his graying hair still damp from washing, his strong hands wrapped around a steaming cup. "You're up early," she said, settling into her usual chair. "Couldn't sleep." Jeremiah's blue eyes, so like her own, studied her face, kept thinking about what happened at the barn raising. Lark's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Quite a sight, wasn't it?" "That's one way to put it." He took a slow sip of coffee. "I've been ranching for 30 years, Lark. Seen men try every trick in the book to break a difficult horse. Never seen anything like what that stranger did." She waited, sensing there was more. Makes a man wonder what kind of past produces skills like that. Jeremiah's tone remained conversational, but Lark caught the underlying question. Her father was not a man who left things to chance, especially when it came to his daughter's welfare. "He seems honest enough," she said carefully. "The other hands like him." "The other hands aren't my daughter." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Lark felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from irritation. "I made a foolish joke, Papa, nothing more." "Did you?" Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. Because from where I sat you looked like a woman who'd just met her match. Before Lark could respond, the kitchen door swung open, bringing with it the scent of hay and horses. Maria Santos, their housekeeper of 15 years, bustled in with her usual morning energy. A sturdy woman with graying black hair and kind eyes, Maria had been more mother than employee, since Lark's own mother had died of fever when Lark was 12. "Buenos dias," Maria said, setting a basket of fresh eggs on the counter. "That new man, he is already working with the horses. Very quiet, very respectful. He helped Jose fix the fence in the south pasture yesterday, without being asked." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. Jose mentioned that. Said the stranger knew more about fence work than most men who'd been ranching their whole lives. "His name is Trace," Lark said, then immediately regretted the defensiveness in her voice. "Trace what?" her father asked mildly. "I don't know." The admission stung more than it should have. What kind of woman defended a man whose full name she didn't even know? Maria began cracking eggs into a heavy iron skillet, the familiar sizzle filling the momentary silence. "Sometimes a man's actions speak louder than his name," she said without looking up. "This one, he has good hands. Gentle, the animals trust him." "Animals trust all sorts of things that aren't good for them," Jeremiah replied, but his tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "It's people who need to be more careful." Lark pushed back from the table, her appetite gone. "I think I'll check on the horses." "Lark." Her father's voice stopped her at the door. When she turned, his expression had softened. "I know you think I'm being overprotective, but you're all I have left of your mother. Can you blame me for wanting to be sure?" The familiar ache of loss settled in her chest. Elizabeth Hollis had been the heart of their family, the gentle balance to Jeremiah's stern strength. She'd been the one who encouraged Lark's independent spirit while teaching her the importance of wisdom over mere rebellion. If she were alive, what would she think of this situation? "I understand, Papa, but I'm not a child anymore." "No," he agreed quietly. "You're not, which is why I expect you to use the good sense your mother gave you." Outside, the morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn. Lark pulled her shawl tighter as she walked toward the corrals, her boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass. The ranch spread before her in the golden light barns and outbuildings arranged with practical efficiency, pastures dotted with cattle, and beyond it all, the rolling hills that gave Cinder Valley its name. She found Trace in the main corral with Midnight Mercy, not riding but simply standing near the great horse, occasionally reaching out to stroke his neck. The stallion, who'd once reared and snorted at the mere sight of a rope, stood calm as a old gelding. It defied everything she'd thought she knew about horse training. "Good morning," she called, leaning against the fence rail. Trace turned, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Miss Hollis." His voice carried a slight accent. She couldn't quite place no southern, not quite western, but something that spoke of long distances and quiet places. "How is he today?" "Content." Trace's hand moved along Midnight Mercy's shoulder with practiced ease. He was never truly wild, just misunderstood. Misunderstood how? Trace was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the horse. But Lark sensed he was weighing his words carefully. Sometimes when a creature's been hurt, it builds walls, gets labeled as dangerous when really it's just protecting itself. The words carried more weight than their simple meaning, and Lark found herself studying his profile. Trace appeared to be somewhere in his early 30s, with the lean build of a man accustomed to hard work. His dark hair showed traces of premature grey at the temples, and lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into sun and weather. But it was his hands that captured her attentions, carved and calloused, yet impossibly gentle with the animals. "How did you know?" she asked. "About Midnight Mercy, I mean. What to say to him?" This time his silence stretched longer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured. "My grandmother used to say that every living thing speaks if you know how to listen. Horses are honest creatures. They don't lie about what they need." And what did he need? Someone to understand that his strength wasn't the problem, it was the fear underneath it. Lark felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. Where did you learn to listen like that? Trace's hand stilled on Midnight Mercy's neck. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he looked at her directly, and she saw something in his dark eyes that made her breath catch a depth of experience that seemed far older than his years. Life teaches you if you pay attention, he said simply. It wasn't really an answer, but something in his tone told her it was all she'd get for now. She found herself nodding, accepting the boundary he'd drawn while filing away the impression that there were stories hidden behind his quiet words. The men seem to like working with you, she offered, trying a different approach. They're good people. Honest work, honest pay. He paused, then added, Your father runs a fair operation. He's a good man, protective, but good. A father should be protective of his daughter. The simple statement carried no judgment, but Lark felt color rise in her cheeks anyway. Sometimes protection can feel like a cage. Trace studied her for a moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he saw more than she'd intended to reveal. Freedom's only as good as the wisdom that guides it, he said finally. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Thomas McBride rode into the yard astride his flashy sorrel gelding, his clothes immaculate despite the early hour. At 26, Thomas was undeniably handsome in a polished way that spoke of privilege and careful grooming. His smile was wide and confident as he dismounted near the corral. "Good morning, Lark," he called out, his voice carrying the hearty cheerfulness of a man accustomed to being welcome wherever he went. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Thomas," she managed a polite smile. "You're out early. Wanted to catch you before the day got away from us." His gaze flicked to Trace, and Lark didn't miss the way his expression tightened slightly. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Thomas McBride." He extended his hand toward Trace, the gesture friendly enough on the surface, but carrying an undertone of assessment. "Trace." The response was quiet, polite, but Lark noticed he made no move to offer a last name. Thomas's smile never wavered, but his eyes sharpened. "Just Trace? Well, that's certainly simple." He turned back to Lark, effectively dismissing the other man. "I was hoping you might join me for a ride this morning. The cottonwoods are turning, and the view from Miller's Ridge is spectacular this time of year." Lark felt trapped between courtesy and her own reluctance. Thomas wasn't a bad man, he'd never been anything but respectful and pleasant. But his attention felt heavy, weighted with expectations she wasn't ready to meet. "That's very kind, but I was planning to help with the horses this morning. I'm sure Trace here can handle things without you." Thomas's tone remained friendly, but there was steel underneath. A lady shouldn't concern herself with ranch work when there are more pleasant pastimes available. The dismissal rankled more than it should have. "I enjoy the ranch work?" "Of course you do, but surely you'd prefer the company of your friends." His smile broadened. "My sister Margaret is visiting from Denver. She's brought all the latest fashion magazines from back east. I thought you ladies might enjoy comparing notes." Lark caught Trace's slight movement as he stepped back, creating distance from the conversation. The gesture felt like abandonment, even though she had no right to expect otherwise. "Another time, perhaps," she said, forcing warmth into her voice. "Please give Margaret my regards." Thomas's expression flickered with something that might have been frustration, but he recovered quickly. "Of course. Perhaps this evening, then. Father's hosting a dinner for the Cattlemen's Association. Your father will be there, naturally, and we'd be honored to have you join us." Before Lark could respond, Jeremiah's voice carried across the yard. "Thomas, good to see you, son." Her father strode toward them, his morning coffee still in hand, his expression genuinely pleased. "How's your father?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Hollis. In fact, I was just inviting Lark to join us for dinner this evening. Mother's particularly eager to see her." Jeremiah's eyes lit up with unmistakable approval. "That sounds wonderful. Lark would be delighted to attend." Lark felt the familiar weight of expectation settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She glanced at Trace, who was now focused entirely on Midnight Mercy, his face carefully neutral. The message was clear. This wasn't his concern. "Excellent," Thomas said, his satisfaction evident. "I'll send the carriage around 6. As Thomas mounted his horse and rode away, Jeremiah turned to his daughter with a pleased expression. "The McBrides are good people, Lark. Thomas would make any woman a fine husband." "I know," she said quietly, watching Trace work with midnight mercy as if nothing had happened. "I should get ready for the day." She turned toward the house, but not before catching one last glimpse of the man who'd tamed a wild horse with a whisper. Whatever his secrets, whatever his past, he'd awakened something in her that 3 days of thinking hadn't been able to quiet. As she walked away, she found herself wondering what it would be like to be understood, the way he seemed to understand the animals in his care. Behind her, she heard the soft murmur of his voice as he spoke to Midnight Mercy, words too low to make out but gentle enough to soothe even the wildest heart. The sound followed her all the way to the house, like a promise she wasn't sure she had the courage to claim. The dinner at the McBride Ranch unfolded exactly as Lark had expected: polite conversation, excellent food, and the subtle but persistent pressure of expectation. She sat between Thomas and his sister Margaret, listening to talk of cattle prices and Denver society with half her attention, while the other half remained fixed on the memory of dark eyes and gentle hands. "Don't you agree, Lark?" Margaret's voice pulled her back to the present. "I'm sorry, what were you saying?" Margaret's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal. "I was telling everyone about the latest fashions from Paris. The bustles are getting positively enormous. I brought sketches if you'd like to see them later." "That would be lovely," Lark replied automatically, earning an approving nod from her father across the table. The evening dragged on with discussions of upcoming social events and the approaching autumn harvest. Lark played her part perfectly, offering appropriate comments and gracious smiles, but as the carriage carried her home through the moonlit valley, she felt more restless than ever. The next morning brought unexpected changes. Trace appeared at the kitchen door before dawn, his weathered saddle slung over his shoulder and his few belongings packed in worn saddlebags. The sight stopped Lark cold as she came downstairs for her usual early coffee. "You're leaving?" The words escaped before she could stop them. He paused in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Time to move on." "But why? The work suits you. The men respect you." "Sometimes respect isn't enough." His voice carried a weight of experience that spoke of previous departures, other places where he'd worn out his welcome or chosen to leave before circumstances forced his hand. Her father appeared behind her, fully dressed despite the early hour. "Second thoughts about our arrangement, Trace. No disrespect intended, Mr. Hollis. You've been fair, but I'm not the settling kind." Jeremiah studied him for a long moment. "This wouldn't have anything to do with yesterday's visitor, would it?" Lark's cheeks burned. She'd hoped her father hadn't noticed the tension between Thomas and Trace, but apparently nothing escaped his attention. "A man knows when he's not welcome," Trace said simply. "You're welcome here," Lark said quickly, then immediately regretted the forward nature of her words. "I mean, you do good work. It would be a shame to lose a capable hand over a misunderstanding." Something flickered in Trace's dark eyes, but it was gone before she could interpret it. "Some misunderstandings are clearer than others, Miss Hollis." Before anyone could respond, Maria bustled into the kitchen, took one look at the scene, and immediately began bustling around the coffee pot with decisive energy. "Too early for departures," she declared firmly. "Coffee first, then talking. Always coffee first." Despite the tension, Lark found herself fighting a smile at Maria's no-nonsense approach to crisis management. Trace seemed equally affected, his rigid posture relaxing slightly as he accepted the cup Maria pressed into his hands. "Now," Maria continued, settling herself at the table with the authority of someone who'd been managing Hollis family dramas for 15 years, "what is this foolishness about leaving?" "Just time to move on," Trace repeated, but with less conviction than before. "Time according to who?" Maria's dark eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a woman who'd raised children, a new deflection when she heard it. "The horses? They like you. The men? They respect you. The work? It gets done well." She paused significantly. Or maybe time, according to some scared feelings. Lark nearly choked on her coffee, while her father made a sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Trace, to his credit, met Maria's gaze steadily. Sometimes moving on is the kindest thing a man can do. For who? The question came from Lark before she could stop herself. For yourself, or for other people? This time the silence stretched longer, filled with the sounds of morning birds beginning their songs outside, the distant lowing of cattle, the familiar creaks of a house waking up. When Trace finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. I've learned that staying in one place too long leads to complications. What kind of complications? Her father asked, his tone neutral but alert. Trace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind that follow a man whether he wants them to or not. It was the first real hint he'd given about his past, and Lark felt her pulse quicken with both curiosity and concern. Are you in some kind of trouble? Not trouble, exactly. He set down his coffee cup, his scarred hands steady, despite the obvious discomfort of the conversation. But I'm not the kind of man who fits into respectable society for long. Let me be the judge of what fits in my household. Jeremiah said firmly, you've done nothing but honest work since you arrived. Whatever happened before you came here is your business, unless it threatens my family or my ranch. Trace looked up sharply, and Lark caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath his usual reserve. And if it might, then we'll deal with it when the time comes. Jeremiah's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. But running away isn't dealing with anything. Sometimes running away is the only option that doesn't hurt innocent people. The words hung in the air like a confession, and Lark felt her heart clench with unexpected sympathy. Whatever shadows Trace carried, they weren't born of selfishness or cowardice. They came from the kind of painful experience that taught a man to sacrifice his own desires for others' safety. What if those innocent people don't want your protection? She asked softly. What if they'd rather face whatever's coming than lose someone She stopped herself before the words went too far, but not before everyone in the room understood what she'd almost said. Trace's expression gentled for the first time since he'd appeared in the doorway. Miss Hollis. Lark, she corrected firmly. If we're going to discuss my future, you might as well use my name. Lark. Her name sounded different in his voice, softer somehow, weighted with something that might have been regret. You deserve better than a man with no past and no future. Shouldn't I be the judge of what I deserve? Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Through the kitchen window, Lark could see 3 riders approaching at a steady pace, their purposeful movement suggesting this wasn't a social call. Trace was on his feet instantly, his whole demeanor changing from resigned departure to sharp alertness. Expecting company? He asked Jeremiah, but his eyes were fixed on the approaching riders. No. Jeremiah moved to the window, his own expression growing concerned as he studied the newcomers. Don't recognize them. Lark joined them at the window and felt her stomach drop. The 3 men wore the hard look of those accustomed to trouble, their clothes dusty from long travel and their hands resting easily near their weapons. The lead rider's gaze swept the ranch buildings with the systematic attention of someone looking for something specific. Friends of yours? Jeremiah asked Trace quietly. No. Trace's voice was flat, but Lark caught the tension beneath it. But they might be looking for me. What do they want? Nothing good. The lead rider dismounted near the front porch, his companions remaining mounted but alert. Their leader was a tall man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Morning, folks. Name's Marshal Stevens. I'm looking for information about a man who might have passed through here recently. Jeremiah stepped onto the porch, his posture calm but ready. What kind of information? The kind that involves a reward for his capture. Stevens pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Man goes by various names, but he's wanted for questioning in connection with a robbery in Colorado Territory. Lark felt her blood chill as Stevens unfolded what was clearly a wanted poster. Even from the kitchen doorway, she could see enough of the sketch to recognize the general features, though the artist had captured none of the gentleness she'd come to associate with Trace's face. "Can't say I recognize him," Jeremiah said after a careful look at the poster. "What makes you think he came this way?" "Last reliable sighting was in Silver Creek, about 50 miles north. Trail's been cold since then, but word is he's handy with horses. Figured he might try to find work at one of the ranches hereabouts." Behind her, Lark heard the soft scrape of a chair being pushed back. When she turned, Trace was gone and disappeared as silently as smoke, despite the weight of his saddle and gear. Only the back door, standing slightly ajar, marked his passage. "Well," Jeremiah was saying, "can't help you there. Haven't hired any new hands recently." It was a lie, and Lark knew her father was risking his reputation to tell it. The realization that he was protecting Trace, despite his own concerns about the stranger's past, filled her with both gratitude and fear. "Mind if we look around?" Stevens asked, his tone remaining polite, but carrying an underlying firmness. Sometimes these drifters hole up in barns or outbuildings. "Help yourself," Jeremiah replied, "though I should warn you, my foreman doesn't take kindly to strangers spooking the livestock." As the marshals began their search, Lark slipped out the back door, her heart pounding. She found Trace in the equipment shed, saddling a sturdy bay gelding with quick, efficient movements. "So it's true," she said quietly. "You are wanted by the law." His hands never paused in their work, but she saw the slight tightening around his eyes. "Not the way you think." "Then tell me the way it really is." He finished cinching the saddle before turning to face her. In the dim light of the shed, his expression was harder to read, but his voice carried a weariness that spoke of years of running. 3 years ago, I was working a ranch in Colorado. Owner's son got mixed up with some bad men gambling debts, borrowed money from the wrong people. When they came to collect, things went bad. Very bad. What happened? The boy tried to rob a bank to pay them off, got himself and 2 innocent people killed in the process. Trace's voice was flat, emotionless, but Lark could see the pain beneath the control. "I was in town that day, saw the whole thing. Tried to stop him, but I was too late." "Then why are you wanted?" "Because when the dust settled, I was the only one left alive who knew the truth. And the boy's father was the territorial judge." His smile was bitter. "Easier to blame the drifter than admit your son was a killer." The explanation hit Lark like a physical blow. "So you've been running ever since?" Seemed like the smart thing to do. Judge Hartwell has a long reach and powerful friends. "But you're innocent." "Innocence doesn't matter much when the man writing the warrants wants you dead." Outside, she could hear the marshals calling to each other as they continued their search. Time was running out, and they both knew it. "Come with me," she said suddenly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "There's a place they won't look." Trace shook his head. "I won't make you an accomplice. You already did that the moment you tamed Midnight Mercy." She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I meant what I said about my word. I'll marry whoever tames that horse. That was you." "That was a joke." "Was it?" She held his gaze steadily. "Because it doesn't feel like one to me." For a moment, the hardness left his face, replaced by something that might have been hope. But then the sound of approaching footsteps brought reality crashing back. "Too late," he said quietly, reaching for the reins. "No." Lark moved between him and the horse, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I won't let them take you for something you didn't do. You don't understand what you're risking." "I understand exactly what I'm risking." She lifted her chin with the same stubborn determination that had driven her to make the challenge 3 days ago. "And I understand what I'm choosing." Before he could protest further, she was gone, slipping out of the shed with the same quiet grace he'd used to enter it. By the time the marshals reached the equipment area, they found only a nervous young woman checking on her father's prize stallion. "Oh," she exclaimed, pressing a hand to her heart, "you startled me." "Sorry, miss," Stevens said, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the shed. "Just checking the buildings." "Of course. Though I should warn you, Midnight Mercy doesn't care for strangers. Best to keep your distance." As if summoned by her words, the great stallion chose that moment to rear and trumpet a challenge that echoed across the valley. The marshals backed away hastily, their search of the area cut short by nearly 2,000 pounds of seemingly agitated horseflesh. But Lark, watching from a safe distance, caught the brief moment when Midnight Mercy's wild performance faltered just, long enough for a shadowy figure to slip from the shed to the barn, under cover of the commotion. The game had begun, and for the first time since the stranger had whispered his way into her life, Lark Hollis was playing for keeps. The marshals rode away empty-handed just before noon, their frustration evident in the sharp way they spurred their horses. Lark watched from the kitchen window until they disappeared over the ridge, then sagged against the frame, with relief she hoped looked like simple exhaustion. "Well," her father said quietly, entering the kitchen with measured steps. "That was interesting." "What do you mean?" She tried to keep her voice level, but Maria's sharp glance told her she wasn't entirely successful. "I mean, a man doesn't vanish into thin air unless he has help." Jeremiah poured himself fresh coffee, his movements deliberate. "And Midnight Mercy doesn't usually perform for strangers." Heat flooded Lark's cheeks, but she met her father's gaze steadily. "Sometimes animals sense when people need protecting." "Animals," he repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what we're calling it?" Before she could answer, a soft knock at the back door interrupted them. Jose Morales, their oldest ranch hand, stood hat in hand, his weathered face creased with concern. "Patron," he said to Jeremiah, "we have a problem with the fence line in the north pasture. The new man, he says he can fix it, but—" Jose's voice trailed off meaningfully. "But the new man isn't supposed to exist right now," Jeremiah finished. "I understand. Tell him to stay out of sight until evening. We'll sort this out then." After Jose left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the kitchen. Lark busied herself with unnecessary tasks, acutely aware of her father's thoughtful gaze. Finally, he spoke. "You realize what you've done, don't you? I helped an innocent man avoid false accusations. You aided a fugitive." His voice wasn't angry, just tired. "However justified you think it was, that's what the law will call it." "The law isn't always right." "No," he agreed quietly. "It isn't, but it's still the law." He set down his cup and faced her fully. "Lark, I need you to think very carefully about what you're getting yourself into. This isn't some romantic adventure. If those marshals find out what really happened here today—" "They won't. You don't know that. And if they do, it won't just be you who suffers. It'll be this ranch, everyone who works here, everyone who depends on us." His voice carried the weight of responsibility that had shaped every major decision of his life. "Are you prepared for that?" The question hit harder than she'd expected. In her determination to help Trace, she hadn't fully considered the broader consequences. The Hollis Ranch employed 24 men and their families. The general store in town depended on their business. Half the valley's economy was tied to their success in some way. She began, then stopped. How could she explain the certainty she felt, the absolute conviction that helping Trace was the right thing to do? "Papa, what if it were me? What if I were innocent but everyone believed I was guilty? Wouldn't you want someone to help me?" Jeremiah's expression softened slightly. "That's different." "How?" "Because you're my daughter, and because I'd know you were innocent." "How do you know Trace isn't?" The question hung between them, and Lark could see her father wrestling with his answer. Finally, he sighed. "I don't, I suppose. But 3 days isn't long enough to truly know a man, Lark. Sometimes the people who seem most trustworthy are the ones with the most to hide." That evening, as twilight painted the valley in shades of purple and gold, Lark made her way to the old line shack near the river. It was a small, sturdy building that had once housed cowboys during cattle drives, but now served mainly as storage for emergency supplies. If Trace had taken her suggestion, he'd be there. She found him sitting on the steps, Midnight Mercy's specially crafted bridle in his hands. The sight of its supple leather, worked with unusual skill, and decorated with small silver conchos, topped her short. She'd seen it in the tack room but never examined it closely. "You made this," she said, settling beside him on the worn wooden steps. "My grandmother taught me leather work." His fingers traced the intricate patterns tooled into the leather. Said it was important for a man to know how to make things as well as use them. "It's beautiful." She touched one of the silver pieces, noting the way it caught the fading light. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary." She was a master at it. Could make leather so soft it felt like silk, so strong it would last generations. His voice carried the warmth of cherished memory. "She made this bridle for her own horsey, wild mustang she gentled when she was barely older than you are now." "What happened to her?" "Influenza when I was 15. Took most of the reservation that winter." The grief in his voice was old but still sharp. "After she died, I started wandering. Couldn't seem to settle anywhere for long." Lark absorbed this information, adding it to the growing picture of the man beside her. "Is that why you understand horses so well, because of her teaching?" "Partly, but mostly because she taught me that every living thing has its own language. You just have to be patient enough to learn it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river flow past in the gathering darkness. Finally, Lark spoke the question that had been building all day. "What will you do now?" "Keep moving, I suppose. Find another place, another job." He didn't sound enthusiastic about the prospect. "For how long?" "As long as it takes." "For what?" This time his silence stretched longer. When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "For people to forget. For the truth to matter more than convenience. For Judge Hartwell to die, maybe." The bleakness in his tone made her chest ache. "That's not living, Trace. That's just surviving. Sometimes surviving is enough." "Is it?" She turned to face him fully. "Because from where I sit, it looks like slow death." His dark eyes met hers, and in the fading light, she could see the exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "What would you have me do, Lark? Stay here and bring trouble to your doorstep? Risk your family's reputation, their safety, their livelihood? I'd have you trust that some things are worth the risk." "Like what?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Lark felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she considered her answer. She could retreat into safety, make some light comment about justice or friendship, or she could step forward into unknown territory with a man who'd already proven he could disappear like smoke when circumstances demanded it. "Like the chance to build something real," she said finally. "Like the possibility that running isn't the only option. And if you're wrong, if staying here brings the kind of trouble that destroys everything you care about, then we'll face it together." The words surprised her with their certainty. 3 days ago, she'd been chafing against the predictable boundaries of her life, frustrated by her father's expectations and Thomas McBride's persistent courtship. Now she was offering to tie her fate to a man with a price on his head and no promise of a future. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." She reached for the bridle, her fingers brushing his as she traced the intricate patterns. "This took time to make, patience, skill, care. You don't create something like this if you believe beauty is temporary. My grandmother made it, not me. But you've kept it, carried it with you through 3 years of running. Why?" He was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was trying to contain. "Because it reminds me that some things endure, that there was a time when I belonged somewhere, when someone believed I was worth teaching. You could belong somewhere again." "Could I?" He looked at her with something that might have been hope, struggling against years of disappointment. "Even knowing what kind of danger follows me?" "Especially knowing that." She set the bridle carefully aside and took his scarred hands in hers. "Because it means you've been choosing to protect people instead of using them. It means your grandmother taught you well." For a moment, his careful control slipped, and she saw the man beneath the caution, someone who'd been alone too long, who'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly welcomed. Then the moment passed, and he gently freed his hands from hers. "Your father was right about one thing," he said quietly. 3 days isn't long enough to know someone well enough to make this kind of decision. How long is enough? A month? A year? Some people live their whole lives with someone and never really know them. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. But sometimes you meet someone and understand exactly who they are in a single moment. Like when? Like when they walk into a corral with an animal that's never trusted anyone, and they speak so gently that fear melts away like ice in spring sunshine. He stood as well, and in the growing darkness she could feel rather than see his smile. You make it sound like magic. Maybe it was. She stepped closer, close enough to catch the scent of leather and horses that seemed to cling to him. Or maybe it was just two lost souls recognizing each other. Before he could respond, before either of them could think too hard about the wisdom of what they were doing, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, soft, more question than statement. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with surprise and something deeper. Lark. Think about it, she said, backing toward her horse. Think about what it would mean to stop running, to trust that some people can be counted on to stand with you when trouble comes. She was mounted and halfway back to the ranch before she allowed herself to think about what she'd just done. Kissed a man she'd known for 3 days. A wanted man. A man with no name, no past he could claim, and no future he could promise. And despite all of that, or perhaps because of it, she'd never been more certain of anything in her life. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors of a different sort. Lark was helping Maria with the washing when Thomas McBride arrived with his sister Margaret and their mother, Mrs. Eleanor McBride, a formidable woman whose opinions carried considerable weight in Valley society. "Lark, dear," Mrs. McBride said, settling herself in the parlor with the air of someone preparing for an important conversation. "We need to discuss recent events." "What events?" Lark asked, though her stomach was already sinking. "Don't play coy, child. The entire valley is talking about yesterday's visit from those marshals, and about the mysterious stranger who's been working here." Margaret leaned forward conspiratorially. "They say he's quite handsome, in a rugged sort of way. Is it true you spoke to him personally?" "I speak to all the ranch hands when necessary," Lark replied carefully. "But this one is different, isn't he, Mrs.?" McBride's sharp eyes missed nothing. "According to my sources, he's the one who tamed Midnight Mercy, the one you made that foolish declaration about." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Lark could feel all 3 pairs of eyes fixed on her, waiting for her response. She chose her words carefully. "I made a joke, nothing more." "Did you?" Thomas's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "Because that's not how it appeared to those who witnessed it." "Thomas," she began, but Mrs. McBride cut her off with a sharp gesture. "The point, my dear, is that appearances matter. Your reputation is at stake, and by extension, your family's reputation, and ours, given Thomas's intentions toward you." "What intentions?" Lark asked, though she was afraid she already knew. Thomas straightened his shoulders, his expression taking on the formal cast of a man making an important announcement. "Lark, I had hoped to speak with your father first, but given the circumstances, I feel I must declare myself plainly." He dropped to one knee beside her chair, producing a small velvet box from his vest pocket. "Miss Lark Hollis, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring was beautiful, a large diamond surrounded by smaller stones, set in gold that caught the morning light streaming through the parlor windows. It represented everything a sensible woman should want: security, respectability, a place in society. Everything except the wild, impossible hope that had taken root in her heart 3 days ago when a stranger whispered to a horse and changed her world forever. Lark stared at the ring, her mind racing. In the silence that followed Thomas's proposal, she could hear her mother's voice as clearly as if Elizabeth Hollis were sitting beside her. The memory came from her 16th birthday, when young David Hutchins had tried to steal a kiss behind the church after the harvest dance. "Lark," her mother had said later, as they brushed out her hair before bed, "someday a man will come into your life who makes you feel like you could conquer mountains or gentle wild horses. Don't settle for less just because it's expected." "But what if that man never comes?" 16-year-old Lark had asked. "Then you wait. And if you must marry for practical reasons, at least go into it with your eyes wide open." Elizabeth had smiled, fingering the silver locket she always wore, the one that now rested against Lark's own heart. "But I have a feeling your man will come when you least expect him." Now, looking at Thomas's earnest face and the expectant expressions of his mother and sister, Lark felt the weight of that locket against her skin like a talisman. Her mother had followed her heart when she married Jeremiah Hollis, choosing love over the safer match her own parents had arranged. The locket held her mother's photograph, but it also held the courage Elizabeth had shown in defying convention. "Thomas," Lark said gently, "this is very sudden." "Not sudden, Mrs. McBride interjected firmly. "Thomas has been courting you properly for months. It's time to make things official before—" She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Before what?" Lark asked, though she suspected she knew. "Before any unfortunate associations damage your reputation beyond repair," Mrs. McBride finished delicately. The insult to Tracy, to her own judgment, sparked anger in Lark's chest. "I wasn't aware my reputation was in question." "Perhaps not yet," Margaret said with false sweetness, "but people talk, especially about young ladies who show too much interest in unsuitable men." "And what makes a man unsuitable?" The question came out sharper than Lark intended. Thomas rose from his knee, the ring box still open in his hand. "Lark, surely you can see the difference between a man of good family and established means, and a drifter with questionable past associations." "Questionable? According to whom?" "According to the United States Marshal Service," Mrs. McBride said crisply. "Really, my dear, must we spell it out? The man is wanted by the law." Lark's heart hammered, but she kept her expression neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about that." "Of course you wouldn't," Thomas said quickly, "which is exactly why you need protection from such influences. As my wife, you'd have my name, my family's standing, security for your future." "And what would you have in return?" The question seemed to surprise him. "A beautiful wife, a good mother for my children, a proper mistress for my household. What more could any man want?" What more indeed? Lark looked at the three faces before her, Thomas handsome and confident, Margaret pretty and pleased with herself, Mrs. McBride formidable and certain of her own righteousness. They represented everything Cinder Valley considered proper and desirable. They also represented everything she'd felt suffocating about her life before a stranger taught her that gentleness could tame the wildest heart. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Time?" Mrs. McBride's eyebrows rose. "My dear child, what is there to consider? Thomas is offering you everything a woman could desire." "Everything you think a woman should desire," Lark corrected quietly. "But perhaps women desire different things than you assume." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. McBride's expression grew cold, while Margaret's mouth opened in a small O of shock. Thomas's face flushed red. "Lark," he said tightly, "I'm afraid I don't understand. Have I done something to offend you?" "No, Thomas. You've been nothing but kind and respectful." And that was true, which somehow made everything harder. But kindness and respect aren't the same as love. "Love?" Mrs. McBride made the word sound like something distasteful. "Child, love is a luxury for those who can afford it. Marriage is a practical arrangement between suitable people. Maybe for some people, but not for me." The silence that followed was thick with tension and disapproval. Finally, Thomas closed the ring box with a sharp snap. "I see," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "And I suppose this sudden change of heart has nothing to do with certain recent arrivals at your ranch." Lark felt trapped between honesty and discretion. "My feelings are my own, Thomas. I don't owe anyone an explanation for them. Even when those feelings are clearly being influenced by someone wholly inappropriate." Mrs. McBride's voice cut like ice. "Someone whose very presence puts this entire family at risk." "That's enough." The words came from the parlor doorway, where Jeremiah stood with an expression that could have frozen hell itself. "I'll thank you not to lecture my daughter in my own house." Mrs. McBride had the grace to look slightly abashed, but her resolve didn't waver. Jeremiah, surely you can see that Lark is making a terrible mistake. Thomas is offering her everything. Thomas is offering her what he thinks she should want, Jeremiah interrupted. But my daughter is perfectly capable of deciding for herself what that might be. Thomas stepped forward, his composure cracking slightly. Mr. Hollis, with all due respect, Lark is clearly not thinking clearly, this infatuation with a wanted criminal. Stop. Jeremiah's voice was quiet, but carried the authority of a man unaccustomed to being disobeyed. You're guests in my home, and I expect you to behave accordingly. That means no more accusations or insults directed at my daughter or anyone else under my protection. The message was clear, and Thomas had the intelligence to recognize it. His jaw worked as he struggled with his temper, but when he spoke again, his voice was level. Of course, I apologize if I've overstepped. He turned to Lark, his expression a mixture of hurt and determination. But my offer stands. When you come to your senses, I'll be waiting. After the McBrides left Mrs. McBride with frost in her farewell, Margaret with obvious disappointment, and Thomas with wounded pride, Lark found herself alone with her father in the suddenly quiet parlor. Well, Jeremiah said finally, settling into his favorite chair. That was educational. Papa, before you say anything, let me ask you something. He leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. When you touch that locket of your mother's, what do you think about? The question caught her off guard. Her hand moved automatically to the silver pendant at her throat. I think about her courage, the way she chose love over convention. Do you know the full story of how we met? Lark frowned. You've told me some of it. You met at a church social, courted for 6 months. That's the polite version. Jeremiah's smile was soft with memory. The truth is, your mother was engaged to another man when we met. A banker's son from Denver, very proper, very wealthy. Her parents thought it was a perfect match. But she chose you instead. She did, but not immediately, and not without cost. His expression grew more serious. When she broke that engagement, half of Denver society cut her dead. Her own parents didn't speak to her for 2 years. We started this ranch with nothing but determination and the clothes on our backs. Lark absorbed this, adding it to her understanding of her parents' story. Do you regret it, the hardship you faced because of her choice? Never, not for a single day. Jeremiah stood and moved to the window, looking out toward the corrals where midnight mercy grazed peacefully. But I won't lie to you about the cost, Lark. Following your heart isn't always easy. Sometimes it means giving up security, comfort, the approval of people you care about. Is that why you've been pushing me toward Thomas? Because you want me to have the security you and Mama didn't? Partly. He turned back to her, his expression complex, but mostly because I'm a father and fathers worry. We want to protect our children from making the same mistakes we did, even when those mistakes led to happiness. You think I'm making a mistake? I think you're 24 years old and capable of making your own decisions, but I also think you're letting your heart rule your head in a situation where the consequences could be severe. Lark stood and joined him at the window. In the distance, she could see Jose and 2 other hands working with the horses, their movements efficient and practiced. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that had shaped her entire life. What if my heart is telling me something important? She asked. What if this feeling I have isn't just infatuation, but recognition? Recognition of what? Of the person I'm supposed to spend my life with. Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Then you'd better be absolutely certain, because once you make this choice, there's no going back. The McBrides won't forgive the slight, and neither will most of the valley. You'll be choosing a hard path, assuming your mysterious stranger even wants to walk it with you. That evening, Lark made her way back to the line shack, her mother's locket warm against her skin, and her heart full of questions she needed answered. She found Trace where she'd expected, sitting on the steps, working on a piece of leather with patient, careful stitches. Making something new, she asked, settling beside him. Repairing something old. He held up a bridle strap, showing her where he'd mended a crack in the leather. Sometimes the strongest pieces are the ones that have been broken and put back together. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. Is that what you're doing? Putting yourself back together? Trying to figure out if that's even possible. He set the leather aside and looked at her fully. I heard about your visitors today. Word travels fast. Small valley, and Mrs. McBride isn't exactly known for keeping her opinions to herself. His expression was carefully neutral. I also heard Thomas McBride proposed. He did. And? I asked for time to think about it. Something flickered in Trace's eyes, relief, maybe, or hope. But his voice remained steady. Smart choice. Marriage is a big decision. Is it? She turned to face him more fully. Because sitting here with you feels like the most natural thing in the world, while sitting in that parlor, listening to Thomas talk about proper household management, felt like suffocating. Lark. I kissed you last night, she said simply, and you kissed me back. Are we going to pretend that didn't mean anything? His control slipped just enough for her to see the longing beneath it. It meant everything. That's the problem. How is that a problem? Because I'm not free to act on it. Because caring about me could destroy your life. He picked up the leather again, his hands needing something to do. Thomas McBride can give you everything. I can't. Respectability, security, a future without shadows. But can he give me love? Real love. The kind that understands without words and trusts without question. You don't know that I can either. We've known each other less than a week. My parents knew each other 6 months before they married, and they spent the first 2 years learning who they really were. She touched his hand, stilling his restless fingers. But they both said they knew something important from the very first conversation. Not everything, but enough to take the risk. The risk of following their hearts. Yes. Trace was quiet for a long time, staring out at the river that reflected the first stars of evening. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he'd been holding back. I've been running for 3 years, Lark, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots or make connections. Telling myself it was the only way to keep from hurting innocent people. And now I'm wondering if maybe I've been running from more than just the law. Maybe I've been running from the possibility that someday, somewhere, I might find a reason to stop. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Lark felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she considered what he was really saying. Have you, she asked softly, found a reason to stop? His eyes met hers, and in them she saw 3 years of loneliness, hope, and carefully buried dreams. I think I might have, but I need to know you understand what you'd be choosing. Not just the romance of it, but the reality. The danger, the uncertainty, the possibility that we might have to leave everything behind if my past catches up with us. I understand. Do you? Because once you make this choice, there's no taking it back. Your reputation will be tied to mine, for better or worse. Your family's standing in the community will suffer. People will talk, judge, possibly shun you entirely. Lark thought of her mother's courage, of the choice Elizabeth had made to follow her heart despite the cost. She thought of the silver locket that had witnessed one woman's leap of faith and now rested against another's heart. Then we'll face it together, she said, echoing the words she'd spoken the night before. But this time, I'm not asking you to trust my decision. I'm asking you to make one of your own. What kind of decision? Whether you're going to keep running from the possibility of happiness, or whether you're brave enough to fight for it. The challenge hung in the air between them, as direct and honest as everything else about their strange courtship. Trace looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing everything, the risks, the possibilities, the choice between safety and the chance at something extraordinary. Finally, slowly, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft leather. When he unwrapped it, she saw a ring knot, elaborate like Thomas's diamond, but beautifully simple. Silver, with a small turquoise stone and intricate engravings that matched the work on Midnight Mercy's bridle. My grandmother made this, he said quietly. Told me to give it to the woman who could gentle my restless heart the way she gentled that wild Mustang. Lark's breath caught. Trace. I know it's not much compared to what Thomas offered. No gold, no diamonds, no promise of an easy life. His voice was steady, but she could see his hands trembling slightly. But it comes with something his ring doesn't. What's that? A man who would rather face whatever comes with you than run away without you. He looked into her eyes, his own dark with emotion. If you'll have me, Lark Hollis. If you'll take a chance on a man with more past than future and nothing to offer but his word that he'll love you truly for however long we have. The proposal was nothing like what society would consider proper. No bended knee, no formal speeches, no promises of material comfort. Just a scarred gentleman offering his heart and asking her to be brave enough to take it. Lark looked at the ring, simple, honest, made with love, and carried through years of uncertainty, and thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears blurring her vision. "Yes, I'll have you. And I'll take every chance, face every risk, defy every convention, if it means building a life with you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Lark felt something settle deep in her chestnut, the flutter of infatuation, but the deep, abiding certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The silver band felt right against her skin, as if it had been waiting her whole life to find its home. When he kissed her this time, it wasn't a question but a promise. And as the stars came out over Cinder Valley, Lark Hollis chose love over safety, trust over certainty, and the wild unknown over the predictable path everyone expected her to take. Tomorrow would bring consequences, she knew. But tonight, with her grandmother's ring on her finger and her heart finally at peace, she couldn't bring herself to care about anything but the quiet joy of finding the person who made her feel like she could tame wild horses with a whisper. The morning after her engagement to Trace brought a reckoning Lark had expected but wasn't fully prepared for. Word of Thomas McBride's failed proposal had spread through Cinder Valley like wildfire, and with it came speculation about her reasons for refusing such an advantageous match. She was gathering eggs from the henhouse when Margaret McBride arrived, ostensibly for a friendly visit but clearly on a mission. Behind her came two other young women from prominent valley families, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed judgment. "Lark, dear," Margaret said with false sweetness, "we simply had to come see how you're faring after yesterday's excitement." "I'm quite well, thank you." Lark continued her work, refusing to be drawn into whatever drama Margaret was orchestrating. "We're all simply dying to know," continued Sarah Fleming, the banker's daughter, "what could possibly have possessed you to refuse poor Thomas? He's such a catch." "Perhaps Lark has her sights set on someone else," suggested Emma Walsh, her tone rich with implication. "Someone more exotic." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Lark straightened slowly, her hand tightening on the basket of eggs. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." "Oh, come now," Margaret laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "The whole valley knows about your mysterious stranger. Some say he's quite handsome, in a rough sort of way. Some also say he's wanted by the law," Sarah added with wide-eyed innocence. "Surely that can't be true." Lark felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I don't listen to gossip." "Of course not," Emma said smoothly, "though one does wonder what your dear mother would think of such unconventional behavior." The mention of her mother hit like a physical blow. Lark's grip on the basket tightened until her knuckles went white. "My mother taught me to follow my conscience, not the opinions of others." "How noble," Margaret said, her smile sharp as a knife. "Though conscience is a luxury not everyone can afford, especially when it puts one's entire family at risk." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. The McBrides had considerable influence in the valley, and crossed, they could make life very difficult for the Hollis ranch. Lark understood the message: clearly conform to expectations or face social and economic consequences. "I think this conversation has gone far enough," she said quietly. "Has it?" Margaret's mask of false friendship finally slipped. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're throwing away everything decent for a man who won't even tell you his real name." "His name is Trace." "Trace what? From where? With what family, what history, what prospects? Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You're ruining yourself for a ghost, Lark. And when he disappears, and he will disappear, you'll be left with nothing but a damaged reputation and a broken heart. The words hit close enough to Lark's own fears to sting. But before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Ladies! Jose Morales appeared at the corner of the henhouse, his weathered hat in his hands, but his expression stern. Patron wants to see Miss Lark at the house, says it's urgent. It was clearly a rescue, and Lark accepted it gratefully. Of course. Please excuse me. As she walked toward the house, she could hear Margaret's voice behind her, pitched just loud enough to carry, Think carefully, Lark. Some mistakes can't be undone. She found her father in his study, standing before the window, with a letter in his hands. His expression was grave, and Lark felt her stomach clench with apprehension. What is it, Papa? Trouble, I'm afraid. He turned, holding up the letter. From Judge Hartwell in Colorado Territory. He's heard rumors that his fugitive has been spotted in our area. Lark's blood turned cold. What kind of rumors? The kind that suggests someone's been talking, someone who knows more than they should about Trace's past. Jeremiah set the letter on his desk with careful precision. The judge is sending a federal marshal, not the local men who were here before, but someone with broader authority, someone who won't be satisfied with a casual look around. When? Within the week, possibly sooner. The time frame sent panic racing through Lark's veins. We have to warn him. Warn him to do what? Run again? Jeremiah's voice was gentle but firm. Lark, maybe it's time to consider that this isn't a fight you can win. What do you mean? I mean that some battles are too big for good intentions and brave hearts. Judge Hartwell has money, influence, and the full weight of territorial law behind him. What do we have? The truth. The truth matters less than you think when it comes up against power and politics. Jeremiah moved to his desk and picked up another paper holder, more worn. I've been doing some investigating of my own since yesterday, about Judge Hartwell, about the case that sent Trace running. Lark's pulse quickened. What did you find? That your instincts about Trace's character may be right, but that won't matter if Hartwell gets his hands on him. Jeremiah's expression was grim. The judge's son wasn't just killed in that bank robbery, was exposed as the mastermind behind a series of crimes. Hartwell's reputation, his political career, everything he'd built, was destroyed overnight. So he needed someone to blame. Exactly. And a drifter with no family, no connections, no one to speak for him was the perfect scapegoat. Jeremiah set the paper aside. But here's what worries me most. Hartwell's not just interested in justice, he's interested in silencing the only witness who could tell the real story. The implication hit Lark like ice water. You think he means to kill Trace? I think he means to make sure the truth dies with him one way or another. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Lark stared at her father, trying to process the full scope of what they were facing. It wasn't just about clearing Trace's name anymore, it was about keeping him alive. There has to be something we can do, she said finally. There might be, but it would require taking a considerable risk. What kind of risk? Before Jeremiah could answer, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the study window, they could see a rider approaching at full gallopone of their own hands by the look of his mount and riding style. That's Billy Hutchins, Jeremiah said, recognizing the young cowboy. He's supposed to be checking the north boundary today. They met Billy at the front door, where he practically fell from his horse in his haste to deliver his message. Mr. Hollis, he gasped, you need to know there's riders coming, 4 of them, maybe 5, armed and moving like they got business here. How far out? Maybe an hour, hour and a half. I rode hard to get ahead of them. Billy wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. One of them's wearing a badge, Mr. Hollis. Federal badge. Lark felt the world tilt around her. An hour wasn't enough time to get word to Trace, wasn't enough time for him to put significant distance between himself and whatever was coming. Billy, Jeremiah said calmly, I want you to ride to the line shack by the river. Tell anyone you find there that they need to clear out immediately. Take the mountain trail. Stay off the main roads." "Yes, sir." Billy remounted, then paused. "Mr. Hollis? Those men riding in, they don't look like they're coming to talk." After Billy rode off, Lark turned to her father with desperation in her voice. "Papa, we have to do something more than just warn him. If what you said about Judge Hartwell is true—" "I know." Jeremiah's expression was resolute. "Which is why I'm going to tell you about that considerable risk I mentioned." "I'm listening." "There's someone in Denver who might be able to help, a federal prosecutor named James Morrison. He's been investigating territorial corruption, including some of Judge Hartwell's more questionable decisions." Jeremiah pulled a telegram from his desk drawer. "I sent word to him yesterday, before I knew how urgent things were about to become." Lark stared at the telegram. "You've been planning this?" "I've been considering options. Morrison's honest, and he has the authority to order a federal investigation. But he'd need evidence, testimony from someone willing to tell the truth about what really happened. Trace would have to come forward." "Eventually, yes, but first he'd have to stay alive long enough for Morrison to build a case." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. Through the front window, they could see 5 riders coming up the main road to the ranchmen, who rode with the purposeful intensity of those accustomed to violence. "Too late," Jeremiah said grimly. "They're here." But as Lark watched the approaching riders, her mind was racing. An idea was forming, dangerous, probably foolish, but perhaps their only chance. "Papa," she said quietly, "remember what you told me about Mama's courage? About how she chose love over safety?" "Lark, no. Whatever you're thinking, trust me." She touched the silver locket at her throat, then moved toward the door. "And whatever happens, remember that some choices are worth the consequences." Before he could stop her, she was outside, walking calmly toward the approaching riders with her chin held high and her mother's courage burning bright in her chest. Behind her, she heard her father's sharp intake of breath, but she didn't look back. Some battles, she was learning, required more than good intentions and brave hearts. Sometimes they required a woman willing to risk everything for the man who'd taught her that even the wildest things could be gentled with the right touch. The lead rider pulled up in front of her, his hand resting casually on his gun. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Miss Hollis, I presume. I'm Federal Marshal Garrett. I believe you have information I need." Marshal Garrett was a lean man with cold eyes, and the kind of stillness that suggested violence was never more than a heartbeat away. The 4 men with him fanned out in a practiced formation, their hands near their weapons, their attention focused on the ranch buildings, as if expecting trouble. "Marshal," Lark said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "What brings you to our ranch?" "You know why I'm here, Miss Hollis." Garrett's gaze swept over her face, reading every micro-expression, with the skill of a man who made his living hunting other men. "I'm looking for a fugitive, a man wanted for robbery and murder in Colorado Territory. I'm not sure how I can help you with that." "Can't you?" Garrett dismounted with fluid grace, never taking his eyes off her. "Because my information suggests you've had recent contact with the man in question." "What information might that be?" Instead of answering directly, Garrett reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small leather pouchon Lark recognized with a sinking heart. It was weathered and worn, decorated with beadwork that spoke of native craftsmanship. "Recognize this?" Garrett asked, holding up the pouch. Lark's mind raced. She'd seen Trace with that pouch, had watched him use the herbs and remedies inside to treat sick animals. It was the medicine pouch that had revealed his knowledge of traditional healing knowledge that came from his grandmother's teaching. "Should I?" she asked carefully. "It was found near your north boundary by one of my scouts, along with tracks that suggest someone's been camping in that area." Garrett's smile was thin and predatory. "Someone who matches the description of my fugitive." Behind her, Lark heard the front door open and her father's measured footsteps on the porch. She felt a moment of relief at his presence. even though she knew it might not matter if Garrett had already made up his mind about what he was going to find here. "Marshal," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the authority of a man on his own land. "I'm Jeremiah Hollis. Is there some way I can help you? You can start by being honest about who's been working on your ranch recently. I'm happy to discuss my employees, but I'd appreciate knowing who's asking and why." Garrett's expression hardened slightly at the challenge to his authority. "Federal Marshal John Garrett. I'm tracking a dangerous fugitive, and I have reason to believe he's been in this area." "What kind of reason?" Instead of answering, Garrett signaled to one of his men, who rode forward leading a familiar horse. Lark's heart sank as she recognized the bay gelding Trace had been saddling when she found him in the equipment shed. "This animal was recovered from a box canyon, about 5 miles north of here," Garrett said. "Abandoned, along with some personal effects that match items known to belong to our fugitive." "Lots of horses in this territory, Marshal," Jeremiah replied calmly. "Can't say I recognize that particular animal." "Can't you?" Garrett's tone suggested he knew better. "Because according to my information, this horse was taken from your own remuda, and the man who took it was someone you'd hired recently, someone who conveniently disappeared when word got out that the law was looking for him." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Lark could feel the trap closing around them, could see that Garrett hadn't come here looking for information. He'd come looking for confirmation of what he already believed he knew. "I think," Jeremiah said carefully, "that we should continue this conversation inside, away from curious ears." Garrett glanced around the ranch yard, noting the cowhands who had stopped their work to watch the proceedings. "Good idea, but my men stay close." Inside the house, the marshal made himself at home in the parlor, settling into Jeremiah's chair with the casual arrogance of a man who took what he wanted. His cold gaze swept the room, taking in family photographs, Elizabeth's needlework, the small personal touches that made a house a home. "Nice place you have here," he said conversationally. "Be a shame if anything happened to disrupt such a peaceful existence." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Lark felt anger flare in her chest, but her father's slight gesture warned her to stay silent. "What exactly do you want, Marshal?" Jeremiah asked. "Information, cooperation, the location of a man who calls himself Trace." Garrett leaned back in the chair, his hand resting casually on his gun. "In return, I'm prepared to be understanding about any unintentional assistance you might have provided." "And if we don't have the information you're looking for?" Garrett's smile was cold as winter wind. "Oh, but you do. The question is whether you're smart enough to share it voluntarily." Before anyone could respond, Maria appeared in the parlor doorway with a coffee service, her expression serene, despite the tension crackling through the room. "Coffee?" she asked politely, setting the tray on the side table. "It's fresh made." "Thank you," Garrett said, though his eyes never left Jeremiah's face. "Your housekeeper?" "Maria Santos. She's been with our family for 15 years. 15 years. Garrett accepted the cup Maria offered, his gaze shifting to her with new interest. "Long time. Must see everything that goes on around here." "I see what needs seeing," Maria replied with dignity. "No more, no less." "Wise woman." Garrett took a sip of coffee, then set the cup aside. "Now, let's discuss your recent employee. The one who disappeared so conveniently when my scouts started asking questions." Lark felt her father's tension, saw the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They were walking a tightrope now, trying to protect Trace without outright lying to a federal officer. "We've had several temporary workers recently," Jeremiah said carefully. "Seasonal help for the autumn roundup. I'm talking about one specific man. Dark hair, mid-30s, carries himself like someone with military training, goes by the name Trace." "That's a fairly common description, Marshal." "Is it?" Garrett's voice sharpened. "What about this, a man with unusual skill with horses, someone who could gentle a wild stallion that no one else could handle?" Lark's blood chilled. Garrett knew about Midnight Mercy, which meant someone had been talking, someone with detailed knowledge of what had happened at the barn raising. "Word travels fast in a small valley," she said, speaking for the first time since they'd come inside. "It does indeed." Garrett's attention focused on her like a predator scenting prey, especially word about pretty young ladies making rash promises. Something about marrying whoever could tame that devil horse. Heat flooded Lark's cheeks, but she held his gaze steadily. People say all sorts of foolish things when they're caught up in the excitement of a celebration. Do they? And do they follow through on those foolish promises? The question was loaded with implication, and Lark felt the trap closing tighter. Garrett knew more than he was letting on, which meant someone had given him detailed information about recent events. I'm not sure what you're implying, Marshall. I'm not implying anything, Miss Hollis. I'm stating facts. Garrett reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper. I have a sworn statement from a reliable witness claiming that you publicly declared your intention to marry the man who tamed Midnight Mercy. And that man was this Trace. Lark's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the formal legal language of an affidavit. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to document her words, to create an official record that could be used against her. Who gave you that statement? She asked. Someone concerned about your welfare, someone who understands the danger you're putting yourself and your family in by associating with a wanted criminal. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Thomas McBride. His wounded pride, his mother's social influence, their family's connections to territorial politics, it all added up to a perfect storm of revenge, disguised as civic duty. Thomas, she breathed, the name escaping before she could stop it. Garrett's smile widened. Young Mr. McBride is indeed concerned about your future, Miss Hollis, as any decent man would be when he sees a lady of good family being taken advantage of by a criminal. Trace isn't a criminal. The words escaped before Lark could think better of them. In the silence that followed, she could hear her father's sharp intake of breath and see Garrett's expression shift from speculation to satisfaction. Isn't he? Garrett leaned forward, his predator instincts fully engaged. Then perhaps you'd like to explain how you can be so certain of that fact. Lark felt the world tilting around her. She'd walked straight into the trap, confirmed Garrett's suspicions with her own desperate words. Now she had to choose a street to backtrack and hope he'd believe her sudden uncertainty or stand by her conviction and face the consequences. She thought of her mother's courage, of the choice Elizabeth had made to follow her heart despite the cost. She thought of Trace's gentle hands and quiet wisdom, of the way he'd looked at her when he offered his grandmother's ring. Because I know the man he is, she said quietly, and I know the difference between justice and persecution. Garrett's laugh was harsh and humorless. Pretty words, Miss Hollis, but I deal in facts, not feelings, and the fact is you're harboring a fugitive from federal justice. The fact is, Jeremiah interrupted, his voice carrying steel beneath the courtesy. You're in my house making accusations without evidence. If you have a warrant, produce it. If not, I'll thank you to conduct your business with proper respect. Respect. Garrett stood slowly, his hand moving to rest on his gun. That's interesting coming from a man who's been lying to federal officers. I haven't lied about anything. Haven't you? Garrett pulled another paper from his vest. Because according to this report from the marshals who were here earlier, you claimed not to have hired any new hands recently. Yet multiple witnesses place a man matching our fugitive's description working on your ranch. The net was closing completely now, and Lark could see no way out that didn't involve someone getting hurt. Garrett wasn't just looking for Trace, he was looking to make an example of anyone who'd helped him. Marshal, she said, stepping forward with a calm she didn't feel. What exactly do you want from us? The truth, the location of the man you called Trace, and your cooperation in bringing him to justice. And if we can't provide that? Garrett's smile was cold as mountain ice. Then I'll have to assume you're obstructing a federal investigation, which carries some very serious penalties, Miss Hollis. For you and your family. Before anyone could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere near the barn. Sharp, rapid shots that spoke of conflict rather than practice. Through the parlor window, Lark could see Garrett's men taking cover behind their horses, their weapons drawn. What the hell? Garrett started toward the window, his hand closing on his gun. Marshal! One of his men shouted from outside. "We got movement in the barn! Someone's shooting!" Garrett spun toward Jeremiah, his weapon half drawn. "If this is some kind of setup—" "It's not," Jeremiah said firmly. "But if there's trouble on my land, I need to know what's happening." More shots rang out, followed by the sound of horses screaming in terror. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to panic the animals. "Sir!" another shout from outside. "We need you out here. Now!" Garrett hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between pursuing his interrogation and dealing with the immediate crisis. Finally, survival instincts won out. "This conversation isn't over," he snarled, heading for the door. "Not by a long shot." As the marshal and his men rushed toward the source of the gunfire, Lark turned to her father with fear and hope warring in her chest. "Papa, if Trace is fighting—" "Then he's buying us time," Jeremiah said grimly. "Time we'd better not waste." He moved quickly to his desk and pulled out a strongbox, his fingers working the combination with practiced ease. Inside, Lark could see documents, money, and something that made her breath catch her, small leather journal bound with a faded ribbon. "What is that?" "Insurance," Jeremiah said grimly, pulling out the journal along with a thick envelope, evidence that might be enough to turn the tables on Judge Hartwell and his pet marshal. "What kind of evidence?" Before he could answer, Maria appeared in the doorway, her usually calm demeanor cracked with urgency. "Senor Hollis," she said quickly, "the shooting, it's not Trace. It's Jose and the others. They're creating a distraction." "Where's Trace?" "Gone. Headed for the mountains like you told him." Maria's eyes were bright with something that might have been pride. "But he left something for Miss Lark." She pressed a small folded paper into Lark's hands. With trembling fingers, Lark opened it to find a brief message written in Trace's careful script. "Trust your father. Trust Morrison. I'll find you when it's safe. T." "Morrison?" Lark looked up at her father. "The federal prosecutor you contacted?" "The same. And if Jose's buying us time, we need to use it." Jeremiah moved toward the back door, the journal clutched in his hand. "There are things you need to know, Lark. Things about that journal, about what really happened in Colorado, about why Trace is the key to bringing down Judge Hartwell's entire corrupt network." The gunfire outside was intensifying, but now Lark could hear her father's men calling to each other in Spanish-coordinated movement, not panic. Jose was indeed creating a diversion, using every bit of his military experience to keep Garrett's attention focused away from the house. "Papa, what aren't you telling me?" Jeremiah paused at the door, his expression complex with years of kept secrets. "That journal belonged to Judge Hartwell's son, the real one, the one who died in that bank robbery. Trace didn't just witness what happened that day, Lark. He tried to save the boy, tried to talk him out of it, and when it went wrong, when the boy was killed, Trace took something from the scene, something that proves the robbery was just the tip of a very large iceberg. The journal? Financial records, names, details of a corruption network that reaches all the way to the territorial capital." Jeremiah's voice was grim. "Information that could destroy Judge Hartwell and half the political establishment of Colorado Territory. Information that makes Trace not just a witness, but the most dangerous man alive to some very powerful people." The pieces were falling into place now, the full scope of what they were facing becoming clear. This wasn't just about clearing an innocent man's name, it was about exposing a conspiracy that involved murder, theft, and the corruption of justice itself. "How long have you known?" "I started suspecting when those first marshals came through, asking questions that seemed designed to confirm what they already believed, rather than discover what actually happened." Jeremiah opened the door, checking to make sure the way was clear. "But I didn't know for certain until yesterday, when Morrison's telegram confirmed what I'd started to piece together." "Where are we going?" "To meet someone who can help us end this once and for all." They slipped out the back door as the sound of gunfire continued from the direction of the barn. In the distance, Lark could see smoke rising, whether from weapons fire or something more serious, she couldn't tell. But Jose's distraction was working. Garrett and his men were fully occupied with what they thought was a gun battle. As they made their way toward the stable, staying low and moving quickly between buildings, Lark felt a mixture of fear and determination. Everything was changing, everything was at risk. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like they might actually have a chance to win. "Papa," she said as they reached the stable door, "when this is over, when we've cleared Tracy's name and exposed the truth, what then?" Jeremiah paused, his hand on the door latch, and looked at his daughter with eyes that held both sorrow and pride. "Then you'll have to decide what kind of life you want to build with a man who'll always carry the scars of what he's been through. Because even if we clear his name, Lark, some things can't be undone. Some wounds don't heal completely." "I know," she said quietly, touching the silver ring on her finger, "but some things are worth the scars." As they slipped into the stable and began saddling horses for what might be the most important ride of their lives, the gunfire outside began to fade. Soon, Garrett would realize he'd been outmaneuvered. Soon, he'd come looking for them, with all the fury of a man who'd been made to look like a fool. But by then, if everything went according to plan, they'd be well on their way to Denver, and the one man who had the power to turn the hunters into the hunted. The game was far from over. In fact, Lark was beginning to realize it was just beginning. The ride to Denver took 2 days of hard travel, pushing their horses through mountain passes and across high plains under the cover of darkness. Jeremiah had contacts along the route, old friends from his military days, who asked no questions and provided fresh mounts when needed. They avoided main roads and settlements, staying ahead of any pursuit Garrett might organize. Federal Prosecutor James Morrison's office occupied the top floor of a stone building in the heart of Denver's government district. A tall man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, Morrison received them with the careful courtesy of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of anyone seeking his help. "Mr. Hollis," he said, shaking Jeremiah's hand with a firm grip, "your telegram was somewhat cryptic, something about territorial corruption and a wrongly accused man." "More than wrongly accused," Jeremiah replied, setting the leather journal on Morrison's desk. "Framed for murder by a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of Colorado territorial government." Morrison's eyebrows rose as he examined the journal's worn leather binding. "That's a serious accusation. What evidence do you have to support it?" "Everything you need is in there," Lark said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. "Financial records, names, details of crimes going back 3 years. And how did you come by this evidence?" Jeremiah and Lark exchanged glances. They'd discussed this moment during their journey, debating how much of the truth to reveal and how much to hold back. Finally, Jeremiah spoke. "It was given to us by the man Judge Hartwell is hunting, the man he's trying to frame for his son's crimes." Morrison opened the journal carefully, his expression growing more serious as he scanned the first few pages. "These appear to be financial records, bank transactions, property transfers." He stopped suddenly, his face going pale. "Dear God, this entry here, it's dated just 3 days before the cattleman's bank robbery." "What does it say?" Lark asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "It's a record of a meeting between young Hartwell and several prominent businessmen, including," Morrison's voice trailed off as he reached the bottom of the page, "including my own deputy prosecutor, David Sinclair." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Lark felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. If Judge Hartwell's corruption network included members of the federal prosecutor's office, then no one could be trusted completely. "There's more," Morrison said grimly, turning pages with increasing urgency. "Names I recognize, amounts that correspond to cases I've worked, decisions that never made sense at the time." He looked up at them with something approaching horror. "If this is authentic, it's evidence of the largest corruption conspiracy in territorial history." "It's authentic," a new voice said from the office doorway. "I can vouch for that personally." They turned to see a man in his 30s with dark hair and familiar scars on his hands. But this wasn't the trace that Lark knew this man wore: a clean suit, carried himself with quiet authority, and most shocking of all, wore a federal marshal's badge pinned to his vest. "Trace." Lark's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Actually," the man said with a slight smile, "it's Marshal Thomas Blackhorse, United States Marshal Service, Special Investigations Division." The world seemed to tilt around Lark as everything she thought she knew crumbled. "But you're wanted by the law. You're running from Judge Hartwell." "I'm running toward him," Trace Thomas corrected gently. "Have been for 3 years, ever since my partner was killed trying to expose Hartwell's network." Morrison was on his feet now, his hand extended in greeting. "Marshal Blackhorse, I wondered when you'd surface. Your supervisor said you'd gone deep cover to investigate territorial corruption. Deep enough that I started to lose myself," Thomas admitted, shaking Morrison's hand while his eyes remained fixed on Lark's shocked face. "Sometimes the best way to hunt wolves is to run with the pack." "You lied to me," Lark said, her voice breaking. "Everything you told me, your grandmother, your past, the reason you were running, all lies?" "Not lies, not exactly." Thomas stepped closer, his expression full of pain. "My grandmother was real, Lark. Her teachings, her wisdom, the ring she made, all of that was true. The leatherwork, the way with horses, the knowledge of traditional healing, sisters learned all of that from her before she died. But you're not a fugitive. I am, in every way that matters to Judge Hartwell. The wanted posters are real, the warrants are real. Hartwell has enough influence to make them stick, even without federal backing." Thomas's voice was heavy with exhaustion. "The only difference is that I chose to become a fugitive in order to gather evidence against him." Morrison was flipping through the journal with growing excitement. "Marshal, this evidence, where did you get it?" "From Hartwell's son, just before he died. The boy was trying to confess, trying to make things right. He gave me the journal and begged me to use it to stop his father." Thomas's expression darkened. "Instead, his father used the boy's death to frame me for the whole conspiracy. So you've been gathering additional evidence ever since." "For 3 years, moving from place to place, documenting the network, following the money trail. But I could never get close enough to Hartwell himself until now." Lark was struggling to process everything, to reconcile the gentle drifter she'd fallen in love with and the federal marshal standing before her now. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" "Because the moment I did, you'd become a target. Because Hartwell has people everywhere, and the only way to protect you was to let you believe I was exactly what I appeared to be." Thomas's voice softened. "And because somewhere along the way, I stopped being Marshal Blackhorse and started being just Tracy, a man who'd found something worth more than justice or revenge." "What's that?" "A reason to stop running." Morrison cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "This is all very touching, but we have more immediate concerns. If Marshal Blackhorse is right about the scope of this conspiracy, then Judge Hartwell isn't working alone. He has federal connections, which means Marshal Garrett isn't acting on official orders." Thomas finished. "He's Hartwell's personal attack dog, using federal authority to hunt me down before I can expose the truth." "Then we need to move quickly," Morrison said, reaching for his telegraph key. "I can have federal agents here within hours to take Garrett into custody." "No." Thomas's voice was sharp. "If we tip our hand too early, Hartwell will disappear and take his network with him. We need to draw him out, make him commit to a course of action he can't back away from." "What do you suggest?" Thomas looked at Lark, his expression full of regret and determination. "We give him exactly what he wants. We let him think he's won." "I don't understand," Lark said. "Garrett's orders are to bring me back to Colorado Territory, where Hartwell can arrange for me to have a convenient accident before I can testify. If we let him capture me—" "Absolutely not," Lark interrupted fiercely. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself." "It wouldn't be a sacrifice if we do it right. If Morrison coordinates with honest federal agents to monitor everything, document Hartwell's actions, catch him in the act of obstructing justice." "It's too dangerous," Morrison said. "Too many variables, too many ways for it to go wrong." "Maybe, but it's also the only way to get them all. Not just Hartwell, but everyone in his network. Everyone who's been corrupting territorial justice for their own gain." The room fell silent as they contemplated the risks and possibilities. Finally, Lark spoke, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "There's another way." "What do you mean?" "Garrett doesn't just want you, Thomas. He wants me too for harboring a fugitive. And he especially wants to make an example of someone who embarrassed him." She lifted her chin with familiar determination. "So we give him what he really wants, a chance to prove his authority by arresting the woman who defied him?" "Absolutely not. Listen to me," she continued, overriding his objection. "Garrett's weakness is his ego. He's not just following orders, he's trying to salvage his reputation after being outmaneuvered by a simple rancher's daughter. If I surrender myself, publicly, in front of witnesses, claiming I'm ready to testify against you, he'll take you straight to Hartwell," Thomas finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. "But Lark, if something goes wrong, then you'll come after me, just like you've been doing for 3 years, except this time, you won't be alone." Morrison was shaking his head. "Miss Hollis, what you're suggesting is incredibly dangerous. These men won't hesitate to kill you if they feel threatened." "They won't kill me," Lark said with certainty that surprised even her. "I'm too valuable as leverage. As long as Thomas is free and has that evidence, they'll need me alive to control him." Thomas studied her face for a long moment, and Lark could see him weighing every angle, every risk, every possibility. Finally, he nodded slowly. "It could work, but only if we control every aspect of it. Only if we have backup plans for the backup plans." "Then we'd better start planning," Morrison said grimly. "Because if we're going to do this, we need to do it perfectly. One mistake, and we all end up dead." As they bent over Morrison's desk to begin planning what might be the most dangerous gambit of their lives, Lark felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like they were finally taking control of their own fate. But as she looked at the man she'd known as Tracer, now revealed as Thomas Blackhorse, federal marshal and dedicated lawman, she couldn't help but wonder if the gentle drifter who'd stolen her heart had been real at all, or just another mask worn by a man who'd been living undercover for so long he'd forgotten who he really was. Only time would tell if the love they'd found could survive the truth they were about to face. The plan they devised was intricate and dangerous, with timing that had to be perfect and contingencies that covered every possibility they could imagine. Morrison's office became a war room, with maps spread across every surface and telegraph messages flying to trusted agents across the territory. "The key," Morrison explained as they worked through the details, "is making sure Garrett believes he's in control while we document everything he does. We need evidence that will hold up in federal court, evidence that shows a clear pattern of corruption and abuse of authority." Thomas studied the map of Colorado Territory, marking locations and routes with the precision of someone who'd spent years planning for this moment. "Garrett will want to take Lark to Judge Hartwell's private estate outside Colorado Springs. It's isolated, defensible, and Hartwell can control who has access." "How do you know about his estate?" Lark asked. "I've been watching him for 3 years, remember. I know his habits, his properties, his security arrangements." Thomas's expression was grim. "The estate is where he conducts business. He doesn't want recorded in official venues. If we can get evidence of what happens there, we can prove conspiracy and kidnapping in addition to the corruption charges," Morrison finished. "But only if Miss Hollis is willing to wear a wire and risk her life to get that evidence." Lark touched the small device Morrison had shown, her barely larger than a pocket watch, designed to record conversations without detection. It was experimental technology, not entirely reliable, but their best hope of capturing Hartwell's words. "I understand the risks," she said quietly, "but this is bigger than just clearing Thomas's name now. If we don't stop Hartwell, how many other innocent people will suffer? How many more crimes will he cover up?" "Your courage honors your mother's memory," her father said, pride and worry warring in his voice. "But Elizabeth wouldn't want you to sacrifice yourself for any cause, no matter how just." "I'm not sacrificing myself. I'm fighting back." Lark looked around the room at the faces of the men who were risking everything to help her. Besides, I have something Hartwell doesn't expect. What's that? Thomas asked. The same thing that let me help you escape from the ranch. The same thing that brought us this far. She smiled, touching her mother's locket. The conviction that some things are worth any risk. They spent the next day refining their plan and positioning Morrison's agents. Thomas would remain hidden in Denver, coordinating with federal authorities to ensure a swift response once they had the evidence they needed. Jeremiah would return to the ranch to maintain the illusion of normalcy and provide a fallback position if everything went wrong. Remember, Morrison cautioned as they made final preparations. Once you're in Hartwell's custody, we can't help you directly without compromising the entire operation. You'll be on your own until you can get clear evidence of criminal activity. How will I know when I have enough? Trust your instincts. The moment you feel you're in immediate danger, or the moment Hartwell says something that proves criminal intent, you find a way to signal us. Morrison handed her a small mirror, polished to a brilliant shine. Use this to reflect sunlight toward the ridge east of the estate. We'll have men watching. That evening, as Lark prepared for what might be her last night of freedom for some time, Thomas found her on the hotel balcony, looking out over the lights of Denver. Second thoughts? He asked gently. Every thought, she admitted, but not about doing this, about us, about what happens when all this is over. What do you mean? She turned to face him, and in the gaslight from the street below, he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. I fell in love with a drifter named Trace, a man with scars and secrets, but also with gentleness and wisdom, a man who understood horses and healing, who carried his grandmother's ring and spoke of belonging somewhere. That man was real, Lark. Everything important about him was real. Was it? Or was it just a role you played so well you convinced yourself? She searched his face in the dim light. Because the man standing before me now is Marshal Thomas Blackhorse, a federal lawman with duties and responsibilities that stretch far beyond any one person's happiness. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the same questions that had been haunting him since the truth came out. I don't know, he said finally. I've been undercover for so long, I sometimes forget where the assignment ends and where I begin. Then how do I know which man I'm really engaged to? The question hit him like a physical blow. He looked down at the silver ring on her finger, his grandmother's ring, carried through 3 years of deception and uncertainty, given in a moment of desperate honesty. Do you remember what I told you about my grandmother? He asked. About how she taught me that every living thing has its own language. Yes. She also taught me that a man's true self isn't what he does for a living, or what name he carries, or what role he plays in the world. It's what he chooses when everything else is stripped away. He took her hands in his, careful of the recording device hidden in her sleeve. When I gave you that ring, I wasn't Marshal Blackhorse carrying out an assignment. I was just a man who'd found someone worth stopping for. And now, when this is all over, when you don't need to be Trace anymore, then I hope I'll have the courage to be whoever you need me to be. Thomas or Trace or someone entirely new, whatever it takes to build a life with you. Lark felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest, and honesty was what she needed most right now. I love you, she said simply. Whatever name you carry, whatever badge you wear, I love the man who whispered to a wild horse and made him trust again. And I love you for your courage, your stubborn determination, your willingness to risk everything for what you believe in. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Which is why, if something goes wrong tomorrow, nothing will go wrong. If something goes wrong, he continued firmly, I want you to know that meeting you, falling in love with you, was the first real thing that's happened to me in 3 years. Whatever else happens, that was worth everything. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city settle into sleep below them. Tomorrow would bring danger and uncertainty, but tonight they had this momentous, intimate, free from the shadows that had defined their relationship until now. Thomas? Lark said softly. Yes? When we get married, and we will get married, no matter what Hartwell throws at us, I want to say my vows to both men, to Marshal Blackhorse, who's dedicated his life to justice, and to Trace, who taught me that the wildest hearts can be gentled with the right touch. And which one will you promise to love, honor, and cherish? The man who contains both of them. The man who's brave enough to be whoever he needs to be, but wise enough to know that some things like love, like trust, like the promise we made to each other don't change no matter what mask you wear. As they held each other in the Denver night, both of them knew that the next 24 hours would test everything they believed about justice, love, and the price of standing up for what's right. But they also knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, not as Trace and Lark, not as Marshall Blackhorse and Miss Hollis, but as two people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other. The morning came too soon, bringing with it the final preparations for their dangerous gambit. Morrison's agents were in position, Thomas had his communications established, and Lark had memorized every detail of their plan. "Remember," Morrison said one final time, "you're not just risking your own life, you're carrying the hopes of everyone who suffered under Hartwell's corruption. But that doesn't mean you have to be foolish about it. The moment you feel you're in real danger, I'll signal for extraction, I understand. And if the wire fails, I'll find another way to get evidence, letters, documents, witness, testimony, something that will hold up in court." As they prepared to part ways, possibly for the last time, Thomas pulled out a familiar object, the leather journal that had started everything. "I want you to have this," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Not for the investigation, but as a reminder of what we're fighting for. That journal represents 3 years of my life, 3 years of believing that justice and truth still matter. Thomas, if something happens to me, if Hartwell manages to silence me permanently, I want you to know that those 3 years led me to the most important thing I've ever found." He cupped her face in his scarred hands. "They led me to you." As Lark rode out of Denver toward her rendezvous with Marshall Garrett, the journal tucked safely in her saddlebags and the recording device hidden in her clothing, she carried with her the weight of everything they were fighting for. Justice for the innocent, punishment for the corrupt, and the chance to build a future free from the shadows of the past. But most importantly, she carried the knowledge that love, real love, the kind that saw through deception to truth, that chose trust over fear, that remained constant even when everything else changed, was worth any risk. Now all she had to do was prove it. Lark's surrender to Marshall Garrett took place at noon in the town square of Silver Creek, witnessed by dozens of townspeople who'd been drawn by word that something significant was about to happen. She rode in slowly, her hands visible and empty, the picture of a woman who'd finally accepted the inevitable. Garrett was waiting with his men, their weapons ready but not drawn, their positions calculated to prevent any possibility of escape. When he saw her approaching alone, his cold smile grew wider. "Miss Hollis," he called out as she dismounted, "I was wondering when you'd come to your senses." "I'm here to surrender myself for questioning," she announced loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear clearly, "and to provide testimony about the fugitive you're seeking." "How cooperative of you," Garrett signaled to his men, who moved to flank her while keeping their weapons visible. "I trust you're prepared to tell the truth about your association with the criminal known as Trace." "I'm prepared to tell you everything I know." Lark kept her voice steady, playing the role of a woman who'd been broken by fear and pressure, "including where you can find him." The bait was irresistible, and Garrett took it completely. "Excellent. We'll discuss the details during our journey to Colorado Territory, where Judge Hartwell is eager to hear your testimony." As they bound her hands and helped her into the wagon they'd brought for transport, Lark caught glimpses of familiar faces in the crowdsome of Morrison's agents, positioned to witness her surrender and follow at a distance. The plan was working so far. The journey to Judge Hartwell's estate took 2 days of steady travel through increasingly remote territory. Garrett's confidence grew with each mile they put between themselves and any potential rescue, and he began to let slip details about their destination and their plans. "The judge will be pleased," he told one of his men as they made camp the first night. 3 years of hunting, and we finally have the leverage we need to bring this to an end." "What about the woman?" the man asked, glancing toward where Lark sat bound near the wagon. "Hartwell wants her alive?" For now, she's useful as bait in case our fugitive tries anything heroic." Garrett's laugh was harsh. "But once we have him in custody, she becomes a liability that needs to be eliminated." Lark kept her expression neutral, despite the chill that ran down her spine. The recording device hidden in her clothing had captured every word, but only if it was still working properly. The technology was unreliable, and she had no way to test it without giving herself away. On the second day, they reached the foothills of the mountains that surrounded Hartwell's estate. The judge's property was impressive, thousands of acres of prime land, protected by natural barriers and patrolled by armed guards, who had the look of men comfortable with violence. The main house was a sprawling stone structure that spoke of wealth and power accumulated over decades. Judge Cornelius Hartwell waited for them on the front steps, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Marshal Garrett," he said as they arrived, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I trust your journey was productive." "Very productive, Your Honor. We have the woman, and she's agreed to cooperate in exchange for lenient treatment." Hartwell's gaze fixed on Lark, with the intensity of a predator studying prey. "Miss Hollis, I presume you've caused considerable trouble with your misguided loyalty to a dangerous criminal." "I've learned the error of my ways," Lark replied, playing her role perfectly. "I'm ready to tell you everything I know about the man who deceived me." "Excellent. We'll discuss the details privately." Hartwell gestured toward the house. "I have some questions that require discreet answers." As they escorted her inside, Lark took careful note of the layout, the positions of guards, the locations of exits, the general organization of the estate. Everything might be important if she needed to escape or signal for help. Hartwell's private study was a monument to ego and power, with walls lined with legal books, photographs of the judge with various politicians, and certificates documenting his rise through territorial government. But it was the desk that drew Lark's attention, covered with papers, maps, and what appeared to be correspondence with various officials. "Now then," Hartwell said, settling into his chair, with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd finally won a long game. "Let's discuss your relationship with the fugitive Thomas Blackhorse." The use of Thomas's real name confirmed what they'd suspected. Hartwell knew exactly who he was hunting and why. But it also meant the judge was confident enough to drop all pretense. "I knew him as Trace," Lark said carefully. "He told me he was a drifter looking for work." "And you believed him?" "I had no reason not to. He was good with horses, worked hard, seemed honest." She injected just the right amount of bitterness into her voice. "I suppose I was foolish to trust a stranger. Very foolish, especially considering his true identity." Hartwell leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying his moment of superiority. "Did you know, Miss Hollis, that the man you thought you loved is actually a federal marshal who's been investigating me for 3 years?" "That's impossible," Lark said, feigning shock. "He's wanted for robbery and murder. A convenient fiction I've maintained to keep him running." Hartwell's smile was cold and satisfied. "The warrants are real enough. I have sufficient influence to make them stick. But the crimes he's accused of were actually committed by my late son. May he rest in peace." The casual admission sent ice through Lark's veins. Hartwell was confessing to framing an innocent man, confident that she would never live to repeat his words. "I don't understand," she said, trying to keep him talking. "Of course you don't. You're just a simple rancher's daughter who got caught up in something far beyond your comprehension." Hartwell stood and moved to a cabinet, from which he withdrew a bottle of expensive whiskey. "Marshal Blackhorse stumbled onto evidence of my son's criminal activities. When the boy was killed trying to rob that bank, Blackhorse became the only witness who could connect those crimes to a much larger network of business arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that have made me a very wealthy man over the years. Land deals, mineral rights, judicial decisions that favor certain interests over others." Hartwell poured himself a drink, clearly relishing the opportunity to boast about his accomplishments. Amazing what a territorial judge can accomplish when he puts his mind to it. The recording device was capturing every word, Lark hoped, but she needed more. She needed specific details, names, evidence of ongoing criminal activity. How did you manage to frame Marshal Blackhorse for your son's crimes? Simple enough. I made sure the investigation focused on the drifter who'd been in town that day, rather than looking too closely at my son's finances or associates. Hartwell's expression darkened slightly. Unfortunately, Blackhorse proved more resourceful than anticipated. Instead of being quietly eliminated, he went underground and began gathering evidence against my entire operation. What evidence? Financial records, correspondence, witness testimony enough to destroy everything I've built if it ever reaches the right ears. Hartwell drained his glass and set it down with sharp precision. Which is why you're here, Miss Hollis. Blackhorse may be clever, but he has one fatal weakness. What's that? He's developed feelings for you. Feelings that will make him take foolish risks to ensure your safety. Hartwell's smile was predatory. When he comes for you, and he will come, we'll be ready. Lark felt her heart hammer against her ribs as the full scope of Hartwell's plan became clear. She was bait in a trap designed to lure Thomas to his death, and the judge was confident enough in his victory to lay out every detail. "You're using me to draw him out," she said, not having to feign the fear in her voice. "Precisely. And when he arrives alone, as his noble nature will demand, my men will be waiting, a fugitive killed while resisting arrest, his accomplice silenced, to prevent her from spreading lies about respected territorial officials." Hartwell's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "Tragic, but necessary for the greater good." The greater good? Order, Miss Hollis. Stability. The continued prosperity of Colorado Territory under proper leadership. Hartwell moved to the window, gazing out over his estate with the satisfaction of a man surveying his kingdom. Sometimes individual lives must be sacrificed to preserve the larger structure of society. The callousness of it took Lark's breath away. This Manthis judge, who'd sworn to uphold justice, was casually planning murder to protect his own corruption. Every word he spoke was being recorded, she hoped, building a case that would finally bring him down. "What if he doesn't come?" she asked. "What if Marshal Blackhorse is smarter than you think?" "Oh, he'll come." Hartwell's confidence was absolute. "I've made sure of that." "How?" Instead of answering directly, Hartwell moved to his desk and picked up a telegram, reading it with obvious satisfaction. "Marshal Garrett's men have been quite busy since your capture. It seems there was an unfortunate incident at your family's ranch." Ice flooded Lark's veins. "What kind of incident?" "A fire, I'm afraid. The main barn, several outbuildings. No lives lost, thankfully, but considerable damage." Hartwell's smile was cruel. "Along with a clear message that worse will follow if Marshal Blackhorse doesn't surrender himself within 24 hours. The news hit Lark like a physical blow. Her father, Maria, Jose, all the people she cared about, they were in danger because of her choices, her involvement in this deadly game. "You're a monster," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I'm a pragmatist," Hartwell corrected mildly. "And now you understand why Blackhorse will come, regardless of the risk to himself. He won't be able to live with the knowledge that innocent people are suffering because of him." A knock at the study door interrupted the conversation. At Hartwell's command, Marshal Garrett entered, his expression grim. "Your Honor," Garrett said, "we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Federal agents, at least a dozen of them, surrounding the estate. They're demanding we release the woman and surrender for questioning." Hartwell's composure cracked for the first time, his face flushing with anger and alarm. "Federal agents? How did they find us so quickly?" "Unknown, sir, but they're definitely federal. I recognize the leader, Morrison from Denver." Lark felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The cavalry had arrived, but their timing might be disastrous if Hartwell panicked and decided to eliminate his witnesses immediately. "This changes nothing," Hartwell said after a moment, his composure returning. "We proceed as planned. In fact, this may work to our advantage." "How so?" Garrett asked. because now we have leverage against federal interference as well as against Black Horse. Hartwell's mind was working quickly, adapting his plan to the new circumstances. Send word to the federal agents that any attempt to storm this property will result in Miss Hollis's immediate execution. Make it clear that their only option is to withdraw and allow us to proceed with our original arrangement. You can't hold off federal agents indefinitely, Lark said, trying to inject doubt into their confidence. I don't need to hold them off indefinitely. Just long enough for Black Horse to arrive and walk into our trap. Hartwell moved to another cabinet and withdrew a rifle, checking its action with practiced ease. When he's dead, the federal investigation dies with him. Without his testimony and the evidence he's gathered, they have nothing but unsubstantiated accusations. What evidence? Lark asked, fishing for more information. I thought you said he had financial records. Had being the operative term. We recovered most of his documentation when we raided his last hideout in Utah Territory. What little remains won't be enough to build a case, especially without his personal testimony to authenticate it. Lark's heart sank. If Hartwell had already recovered most of Thomas's evidence, then their entire plan might be built on a foundation of false hope. But she forced herself to remain calm, to continue gathering information that might still prove useful. What about the federal prosecutor, Morrison? Won't he keep investigating? Morrison's career depends on successful prosecutions, not failed fishing expeditions. Without solid evidence, he'll move on to cases he can actually win. Hartwell's confidence was returning as he talked through the situation. And if he proves persistent, well, territorial politics can be quite treacherous. Accidents happen to overzealous prosecutors. The casual threat against Morrison's life was another piece of evidence for their case, assuming the recording device was still functioning. But Lark was beginning to worry about how much longer she could maintain her cover. Hartwell was smart, and if he started to suspect that she wasn't quite the broken, cooperative victim she was pretending to be. Sir, Garrett said, returning to the window, the federal agents are taking positions around the perimeter. It looks like they're preparing for a siege. Let them. This estate has defensible positions and enough supplies to outlast a week-long siege if necessary. Hartwell joined Garrett at the window, studying the federal positions with a military eye. More importantly, every hour they wait is another hour for word to reach Black Horse that his lady love is in mortal danger. As if summoned by his words, a new commotion arose from the front of the estate. Shouts, the sound of horses, the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Hartwell and Garrett both spun toward the noise, their expressions shifting from confidence to alarm. What the hell? Garrett started toward the door, but before he could reach it, it burst open. Thomas Black Horse stood in the doorway, no longer the gentle drifter or even the federal marshal, but something harder and more dangerous. His clothes were torn from hard travel, his face was streaked with smoke and dust, and his eyes held the cold fury of a man who'd seen everything he cared about threatened. Judge Hartwell, he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its calm tone. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Behind him, Lark could hear the sounds of fighting throughout the estate house, gunshots, the crash of doors being kicked in. Whatever was happening, it was big enough to keep Garrett's men busy. Marshal Black Horse, Hartwell said, recovering his composure with impressive speed. How good of you to accept our invitation. Let her go, Hartwell. Your fight is with me. On the contrary, my dear Marshal, my fight is with everyone who threatens the order I've worked so hard to establish. Hartwell raised his rifle, not pointing it directly at Thomas, but making its presence unmistakably clear. And Miss Hollis has proven herself to be quite the threat indeed. The standoff crystallized in that moment. 3 people in a room, each holding cards in a deadly game, each calculating the odds of survival. Outside, the sounds of battle continued, but inside Hartwell's study, time seemed suspended. Thomas's eyes met Lark's across the room, and in them she saw love, determination, and something else, signal perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The game was no longer about evidence or justice or even survival. It was about whether love and courage could triumph over corruption and fear, whether two people who'd found each other against impossible odds could find a way to build a future from the ashes of the past. And as Thomas took a step forward into the room, his hand moving slowly toward his weapon, Lark knew that the final chapter of their story was about to be written. "That's far enough, Marshal," Hartwell said, raising his rifle to point directly at Thomas's chest. "One more step and Miss Hollis dies before you can draw your weapon." Thomas froze, his hand inches from his gun, his eyes never leaving Hartwell's face. "Hurt her, and federal agents won't be your biggest problem." "Federal agents?" Hartwell laughed, though the sound held no humor. "You mean Morrison's men? They're contained, Marshal. My security force is quite capable, and they have orders to hold their positions no matter what." "Your security force is busy fighting the 10th Cavalry Regiment," Thomas said calmly. "Turns out Morrison had more resources available than you anticipated." For the first time, genuine alarm flickered across Hartwell's features. "The army? That's impossible. They have no jurisdiction." "They do when territorial corruption involves federal crimes, federal witnesses, and federal officers." Thomas's voice remained steady, but Lark could see the tension coiled in his shoulders. "You made one crucial mistake, Hartwell. You assumed I was working alone." "You've been working alone?" "For 3 years. For 3 years, I've been gathering evidence and building a case, but I haven't been doing it in isolation." Thomas's slight smile was cold as winter ice. "Did you really think the U.S. Marshal Service would send one man to investigate a conspiracy this large without backup?" The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Garrett, who'd been edging toward a position where he could get a clear shot at Thomas, stopped abruptly. "You're bluffing," Hartwell said, but his confidence was cracking. "If you had backup, where have they been for 3 years? Building their own cases against your network. Following the money trails, documenting the corruption, gathering evidence from sources you never suspected." Thomas took another careful step into the room. "Every crooked land deal, every fixed court case, every bribe and kickback, it's all been recorded, documented, cross-referenced." "That's impossible." "Is it? Tell me, Hartwell, when was the last time you personally verified the loyalty of every clerk in your office? Every secretary, every assistant, every minor official who handles your correspondence?" Thomas's eyes were hard as stone. 3 years is a long time to build a network of informants. Lark felt her breath catch as she realized what Thomas was revealing. The investigation hadn't been a one-man crusade, it had been a coordinated federal operation, with Thomas as the visible target drawing attention while others worked in shadow. "Even if that's true," Garrett interjected, "it doesn't change the situation here. We still have the woman. We still have leverage." "Do you?" Thomas asked mildly. "Because I count at least 50 federal agents and soldiers surrounding this estate, while you have maybe a dozen men left standing. The mathematics don't favor extended resistance." The sounds of fighting outside were definitely diminishing, Lark realized. Whatever battle had been raging was winding down, and from the sound of authoritative voices calling orders, it wasn't Hartwell's men who were in control. "You're forgetting something, Marshal," Hartwell said, desperation beginning to edge his voice. "I still have your lady love at gunpoint. Surrender now, or watch her die." "You're forgetting something too, Judge." Thomas's eyes met Lark's, and she saw something in them that made her heart race not fear but anticipation. "You're assuming Lark is helpless." The statement hung in the air for a moment before Lark understood. Her left hand moved slowly to the hidden device in her clothing, while her right reached into her boot for the small knife Morrison had given her a knife. She'd kept concealed through 2 days of captivity. "What are you?" Hartwell started to turn toward her, but Thomas chose that moment to move. Everything happened in seconds that felt like hours. Thomas dove sideways as Hartwell swung his rifle toward Lark. Garrett went for his gun, shouting a warning. But Lark was already moving, the knife flashing in her hand as she cut the ropes that bound her wrists while simultaneously activating the emergency signal on Morrison's device. Hartwell's shot went wide, as Thomas rolled behind a heavy desk. Garrett's weapon cleared its holster just as the study door exploded inward, revealing Morrison and two federal agents with weapons drawn. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." Garrett spun toward the new threat, giving Thomas the opening he needed. The marshal's Colt appeared in his hand with practiced speed, the barrel centering on Garrett's chest. "Drop it, Garrett. You're outnumbered and outgunned." For a moment, the corrupt marshal hesitated, his weapon halfway raised. Then common sense prevailed, and he let his gun fall to the floor. Hartwell, however, was not finished. Backed into a corner with his entire empire crumbling around him, he swung his rifle toward Lark with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. "If I'm finished, then so are you." The shot that ended Judge Cornelius Hartwell's reign of corruption came not from Thomas's gun, not from Morrison's agents, but from the small derringer that Lark had produced from a hidden pocket in her dress, another gift from Morrison that she'd hoped never to use. The judge's rifle clattered to the floor as he collapsed, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. His last words were a whispered, "How?" "Because," Lark said quietly, lowering the smoking derringer, "some people underestimate what a woman will do to protect the people she loves." In the sudden silence that followed, the only sounds were the distant voices of federal agents securing the rest of the estate and the soft hiss of the recording device as it finally stopped working. Morrison stepped forward, holstering his weapon as he surveyed the scene. "Miss Hollis, are you injured?" "No," she said, though her hands were shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. "But I think I got everything we need on the recording device." "Even if we didn't," Thomas said, rising from behind the desk and moving quickly to her side. "Hartwell confessed to enough crimes in front of witnesses to put his entire network away for life." "What about the evidence he claimed to have recovered?" Lark asked. "He said most of your documentation was gone." Thomas's smile was the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him since his identity was revealed. He was half right. We did lose some of the evidence when they raided our hideout in Utah, but we kept copies of everything important in 3 separate locations. 3. One with Morrison in Denver, one with my supervisor in Washington, and one with your father back at the ranch. Lark stared at him in shock. "Papa knew this whole time?" "Not everything, but enough to play his part when the time came." Thomas reached for her hands, careful of the small burns where the ropes had chafed. "Did you really think we'd put you in this kind of danger without a backup plan?" Before she could answer, new voices echoed from the hallway, familiar voices that made her heart leap with relief. "Lark, where is my daughter?" "In here, Papa," she called, and seconds later, Jeremiah burst into the study, followed closely by Maria and Jose. "Mija!" Maria exclaimed, rushing to embrace her. "When we heard about your plan, we thought you were the bravest fool in Colorado territory." Jeremiah finished, pulling both women into his arms. "Just like your mother." As federal agents led Garrett away in chains, and Morrison coordinated the arrest of Hartwell's remaining men, the study gradually emptied until only Thomas and Lark remained, standing amid the wreckage of a 3-year conspiracy. "So," Lark said finally, "Marshal Thomas Blackhorse." "Yes? Are you planning to disappear again? Back to Washington? Back to your duties as a federal officer?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands gentle as they traced her face. "Do you remember what I told you about my grandmother's ring? About giving it to the woman who could gentle my restless heart?" "I remember." "Well, it turns out she was right about something else too. She always said that when a man finds his true home, he knows it in his bones. Knows it in a way that has nothing to do with geography or duty or the roles he plays in the world. And my bones are telling me that home is wherever you are, whether that's Cinder Valley or Washington or anywhere else in the world." He lifted her left hand, touching the silver ring that had survived everything they'd been through. "If you'll still have me, both of Meath Marshall and the Drifter and whoever I turn out to be when I'm not pretending to be someone else." Lark's answer was a kiss that tasted of gunpowder and tears, and the promise of a future built on truth instead of deception. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now, we plan a wedding, a real one this time, with your father's blessing and the whole valley watching." Thomas's eyes sparkled with something she hadn't seen since that first night, at the line "shack pure, uncomplicated happiness." "And then we figure out how to build a life together." "What kind of life?" "The kind where wild horses get gentled with patience instead of broken with force. Where justice means something more than political convenience. Where two people who found each other against impossible odds get to discover what's possible when they're not running from the past." As they stood together in the ruins of Judge Hartwell's empire, surrounded by the evidence of corruption finally brought to light, Lark thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a joke, a wild challenge thrown out in a moment of celebration, but it had become something far more important, a test of courage, trust, and the belief that some things were worth any risk. The community bell that would call Cinder Valley together for their wedding was still weeks away. But in that moment, with Thomas's arms around her and the truth finally set free, Lark could already hear its joyful sound echoing across the mountains, proclaiming that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest promise: to love someone truly, completely, and without reservation, no matter what storms might come. 6 months later, the new wooden sign at the entrance to their ranch caught the morning light as Lark made her way to the corrals. "Hollis, Black Horse Ranch," it read in carefully carved letters, with smaller text below. "Home of Midnight Mercy's legacy." The sign represented more than a change of ownership. It symbolized the blending of two lives and the creation of something entirely new. The trial of Judge Hartwell's corruption network had dominated territorial headlines for weeks. 15 officials had been indicted, 7 convicted, and the entire structure of Colorado territorial justice had been reformed. Thomas's testimony, supported by Lark's recordings and 3 years of accumulated evidence, had proven devastating to the defense. Even in death, Hartwell's legacy had been thoroughly dismantled. But for Lark, the most satisfying outcome hadn't been the convictions or the newspaper coverage proclaiming the triumph of justice. It had been the quiet moment 3 months ago when Thomas officially resigned from the U.S. Marshal Service and chose to stay in Cinder Valley permanently. Ready to give up the excitement of federal law enforcement for the peaceful life of a rancher, she'd asked him the night before he submitted his resignation. Ready to trade the excitement of hunting other people's shadows for the adventure of building something with you, he'd replied, and she'd known he meant every word. This morning, she found him in the main corral with Midnight Mercy, but they weren't alone. 3 young colts, Midnight Mercy's offspring, with Select Mara, stood nearby, watching their father with the alert intelligence that marked them as special. The breeding program they'd started was already showing remarkable results, producing horses with both Midnight Mercy's spirit and an unusual tractability. "How are they looking?" she asked, joining Thomas at the fence. "Like their father, intelligent, strong-willed, but willing to trust the right person." Thomas's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd found his calling. "Jose thinks the black colt will be ready for training by spring. And you, what do you think?" "I think we're creating something that will outlast both of us. Horses that remember gentleness, that pass that memory on to their children." He turned to smile at her, his face peaceful in a way that still sometimes surprised her. "Your mother would have approved." Lark touched the silver locket at her throat. Elizabeth's photograph still there, but joined now by a small picture of Thomas on their wedding day. "I think she would have loved seeing what we've built here." The wedding itself had been everything they'd dreamed of, and more. The entire valley had turned out, including several prominent families who'd initially been scandalized by Lark's choice, but had gradually come to respect Thomas's integrity and work ethic. Even Thomas McBride had attended, bringing a wedding gift and a gracious acknowledgement that he'd been wrong about both Lark's character and her judgment. She knew what she wanted, he'd told Thomas during the reception, and she had the courage to claim it. Can't fault a woman for that. The ceremony had taken place in the same meadow where the barn-raising celebration had occurred, with Midnight Mercy himself playing an honored role. As Thomas and Lark exchanged vows, the great stallion had stood nearby, calm and regal, as if blessing the union he'd helped create. But it was the private moment afterward, when they'd spoken their personal promises to each other away from the crowd, that Lark treasured most. They'd stood by the river, where they'd first talked about trust and belonging, and Thomas had whispered the same gentle words he'd used to tame midnight mercy words in his grandmother's language that meant peace, courage, home. "What did you tell him that day?" she'd asked. "What did you whisper that made him trust you?" "That I understood his pain, that I knew what it was like to be wild and afraid and convinced that no one could be trusted." Thomas had taken her hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "And that sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone who sees past the fear to the heart underneath." Now, months later, watching him work with the horses that had become his passion and his purpose, Lark marveled at the transformation in both of them. Thomas had found peace in honest work and the rhythm of seasons. She had discovered that love could indeed be worth any risk, any sacrifice, any challenge. "Speaking of children," she said, moving closer to him at the fence, "there's something we need to discuss." Something in her tone made him turn, his full attention focused on her face. "What is it?" "Well, it seems that our efforts to build a legacy together have been more successful than we anticipated." For a moment, he didn't understand. Then comprehension dawned, and his expression shifted from curiosity to wonder, to pure joy in the space of a heartbeat. "Lark, are you saying—" "I'm saying that by next spring, Midnight Mercy won't be the only one with offspring to train." She placed his hands on her still, flat stomach, smiling at the awe in his eyes. "Assuming, of course, that you're ready for that kind of adventure." His answer was a kiss that tasted of promises and possibilities, deep enough to make the horses snort with what sounded suspiciously like approval. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing. "Ready?" Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Lark, I've been ready for this my whole life. I just didn't know it until I met you." As they stood together in the morning light, surrounded by the horses they'd gentled and the life they'd built, Lark thought about the journey that had brought them here. It had started with a wild challenge and a stranger's whisper, but it had become something far deeper, a testament to the power of trust, the courage required for real love, and the belief that some promises were meant to be kept regardless of the cost. "You know," she said, leaning against his shoulder, as Midnight Mercy approached the fence with his characteristic dignity, "I never did thank you properly for taming that devil horse." "Didn't you?" Thomas's smile held all the warmth of their shared memories. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you kept your word perfectly." "How so?" "You married the man who tamed Midnight Mercy, and in the process, you tamed something in me that I'd thought was wild beyond redemption." "What was that?" "The part of my heart that never believed it was safe to stay in one place, to build something lasting, to trust that happiness could survive the storms." He gestured toward the ranch, spread out before them the corrals and pastures, the rebuilt barn, the house where Maria was already planning nursery preparations. "Look what we've created together, Lark. Look what becomes possible when wild things learn to trust." As if responding to his words, Midnight Mercy extended his great head over the fence, allowing Thomas to stroke his neck with the same gentle touch that had changed everything on that long-ago day. The stallion's dark eyes were peaceful, content, free of the fear and fury that had once defined him. Just like the man beside her, Lark realized. Just like herself, they'd all been wild once, in their own ways untrusting, defensive, convinced that safety lay in keeping others at a distance. But they'd learned that true strength came not from isolation but from connection, not from walls but from the courage to let them down. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The excitement of your old life, the danger, the purpose, the fight for justice?" Thomas considered the question seriously, his gaze moving from Midnight Mercy to the colts, from the mountains that surrounded their valley, to the woman who'd become his anchor and his adventure, all at once. "No," he said finally, "because I've learned that the biggest adventures aren't about hunting down corruption or bringing criminals to justice, as important as that work is. They're about the daily choice to build something beautiful with someone you love. They're about watching wild horses learn to trust, about raising children who know they're safe, about creating a legacy that matters long after you're gone. And this is enough for you, this quiet life? This quiet life, Thomas said, his voice rich with contentment, contains more adventure and purpose than all my years of chasing shadows. Because every day I get to wake up next to the woman who saw past my masks to the man underneath. Every day I get to work with creatures that teach me new things about patience and trust. And every day I get to know that what we're building here will outlast us both. As the sun climbed higher over Cinder Valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Lark and Thomas stood together in comfortable silence, planning the future they would build for their child, their horses and themselves. The community bell that had called them to their wedding would soon ring again for church services, harvest celebrations, and all the ordinary miracles that marked the passage of time, in a place where people knew each other's names and cared about each other's dreams. But for now, this moment was enough: the warmth of the morning sun, the gentle sounds of horses moving in the pasture, the solid presence of the man who'd kept his promise to love her truly, for however long they had. It was a quiet happiness, perhaps, but it was deep and real and built to last. Sometimes, Lark reflected as Thomas's arms encircled her and their unborn child, the wildest dreams were the ones that led you home. Sometimes the greatest adventures began with the simplest words, "I'll marry whoever tames this horse." And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those words became the foundation for a love story that lasted a lifetime, a story about two people who learned that the most powerful force in the world wasn't wildness or fear or the need to keep running, but the courage to stand still long enough to let someone love you completely. In the distance, Midnight Mercy lifted his head and called out across the valley, a sound that spoke of contentment, belonging, and the deep peace that comes when wild things finally find their home. It was a sound that would echo through generations of horses and children, carrying with it the memory of a joke that became a promise, a whisper that became a legacy, and a love that proved strong enough to gentle even the wildest heart.